Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Whether you're lying in bed, spiralling softly towards sleep, or just here to fill your headphones while working, showering, or pacing under a ceiling fan, you're in the right place. This is slow science for tired minds, calm storytelling for curious apes. If you're one of the strange and wonderful humans who enjoys long-form, science-based content told softly, where facts matter more than flair, and mysteries allowed to stay mysterious, consider tapping like and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it helps this type of thoughtful, educational storytelling reach more sapiens around the world. Feel free to share in the comments how you use this channel. Is this your bedtime story ritual? Your deep focus work companion? Or maybe you're listening from halfway across the planet, chasing the stars from a different time zone entirely, and if you happen to drift off partway through, don't worry. Timestamps are in the description below, so the next day you can pick up exactly where you left off. Because every part of this story is worth hearing, and the whole arc, it's a journey. Here at Sleepless Homo, I don't have all the answers. This is science told humbly, from evidence, archaeological layers, and a long tradition of careful study. And, as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's begin. This time, with a very old friendship. One that began in the snow around a fire, with a creature that didn't run away. What made the first wolves stay close, but not strike? Somewhere in the cold dark of the Upper Paleolithic, a fire was burning. It hissed and cracked inside a shallow windbreak of mammoth bone, flickering across the damp fur of sleeping humans. The flame was not large, but it was enough. Just enough to make the night survivable. Just enough to scare away most things with teeth, but not all, because something stayed at the edge of that light. We don't know exactly when it began, but sometime between 35,000 and 30,000 years ago, in the shadow of a glacial world, there were wolves who didn't leave. They didn't pounce. They didn't run. They stayed. Just outside the ring of warmth and waste and flickering noise that surrounded a human camp. Close enough to smell the bones, close enough to hear us breathe. Not yet dogs, but not quite wild anymore either. This is not a story of when wolves were domesticated, because we don't know that yet. This is something earlier, stranger, and harder to prove. This is the story of the wolves who started watching us. Most of what we know about this period comes not from clear fossils of dogs, but from an absence, or rather, from a pattern of absences. Scattered across Europe and northern Asia, from France to the Altai, are Paleolithic sites where humans and wolves left their mark in the same sediment. But the marks don't always make sense. Some campsites have piles of butchered deer, cut mammoth bones and flint blades still sharp to the touch. But the wolf bones there are different. Unchewed, unbroken, rare, sometimes present without evidence of being prey, sometimes strangely intact. To understand what that means, we have to step sideways into taphonomy. That's the science of how dead things become fossils, or don't. It's a forensic language of scratches and breaks and bite marks, and when you apply it to ancient campsites, you can often tell what kind of animals were being eaten, and which were just there. For example, when wolves were hunted and butchered, their bones show cut marks. When wolves scavenged, you might find teeth marks on leftover bones from human kills, but at some Upper Paleolithic sites, that expected story doesn't appear. Instead, we find fragments of wolves that show neither violence nor utility. No cut marks, no skinning traces, no signs they were food, and yet, they were there. One of the clearest hints comes from the famous site of Goyet in Belgium. Deep inside a cave system used by humans for over 30,000 years, archaeologists found a canid skull, large, broad, with features that some originally thought might represent an early dog. Later analyses questioned that interpretation, arguing it still resembled a wolf. But here's the real puzzle. It wasn't butchered, and it wasn't discarded in the same way as prey. It seemed placed, preserved. Not ritually necessarily, but with a kind of passive care. It's not alone. In sites like Predmosty in the Czech Republic and Kostenki in Russia, wolf-like remains show up in unusual contexts, sometimes with apparent burials or associated with human activity, but again without the clear signs of predation. And then there's the matter of proximity. In several cases, canid bones show up clustered near hearths or habitation zones, not dragged there by accident, not dropped in the middle of a hunt, just quietly present, coexisting. We have no way of knowing whether they died there naturally, or were brought in or wandered in and froze, but their pattern defies randomness. These were places where humans were living, repeatedly, seasonally, or long-term, and where wolves were not just passing through. Something drew them, something made them stay. One possibility is simple scavenging, that wolves were following us for our waste, and in a sense that's probably true. Humans left behind bones, offal, feces, food scraps, and sometimes full carcasses. All of these would be incredibly attractive to carnivores, but most carnivores didn't loiter. Hyenas, lions, saber-toothed cats. They usually avoided direct contact with humans unless desperate. And if they did approach a camp, the signs are violent. Bones get gnawed, skulls get crushed, people get mauled. Wolves, by contrast, seem to have approached with something else. Caution, curiosity, maybe even calculation. Wolves are social hunters and extremely good at reading behaviour. Modern wolves can quickly assess the risk of approaching new prey or human structures, and even today they sometimes scavenge the edges of human settlements, especially in winter. What makes this ancient version so fascinating is that it seems to predate domestication. These were not dogs. Their bones, in the rare cases where we have them, do not show the anatomical changes associated with domestication. The snouts are long, the teeth are crowded, the brains are full-sized. They were still wild, but they were watching. The context matters here. 35,000 years ago, the world was in flux. The last glacial period was deepening. Europe and much of northern Asia were dry, cold, and treeless. Game was large but mobile. People lived in small bands, moving seasonally between shelters. Camps were temporary, but often reused. Fire was a constant, and around that fire, life was messy. Skins were scraped, food was boiled, bones were cracked. The detritus of human life created ecological niches. A midden is a kind of invitation. It's not hard to imagine what that might have looked like. The juvenile wolf, separated from its pack, stumbles across a human camp. It watches from a distance, smells meat, hears no immediate threat. Maybe it waits until night, then creeps closer to chew a discarded femur. No one notices, or maybe someone does, and throws a rock. The wolf retreats. But the pattern begins. Day by day, encounter by encounter, a kind of parallelism evolves. Wolves learn that some human groups are dangerous and some aren't, that some throw rocks but leave food, that some fires are worth watching. We don't know how long this went on. But it likely wasn't fast. Evolution rarely is. This would have been a dance of generations. Some wolves tolerated humans, some didn't. Those who lingered might have passed on traits, calmer temperaments, greater tolerance, less flight response. And in turn, humans may have tolerated certain wolves. Maybe the quiet ones. The ones who warned of predators. The ones who cleaned up scraps without threatening children. Not out of sentimentality, just out of pragmatism. These wolves weren't friends, but they weren't enemies either. And this matters, because domestication is not a light switch. It's not a moment. It's a gradient. A slow slope from avoidance to tolerance to alliance. The first step isn't breeding, it's staying. Some researchers describe this stage as commensalism, a relationship where one species benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. In this view, wolves may have gained access to food, while humans experience no immediate cost. But over time, that balance may have shifted. If wolves started warning of danger, or keeping scavengers away, or providing warmth by proximity, then the relationship edges toward mutualism. It's here that the story of dogs begins. But that's not today's story. We're still earlier. We're in the chapter before anyone knew they needed each other. It's worth noting that this pattern has been observed in other animals. Modern commensal relationships have developed in urban areas between humans and raccoons, foxes, even crows. But in the Pleistocene, the ecosystem was raw. There were no villages, no walls, no waste piles that weren't surrounded by spears. For a predator to approach a human camp and survive, it needed to be very, very careful. which means the ones that did may already have been different. Of course, we have to be cautious. It's easy to romanticize this, to project loyalty or companionship where there was only hunger. But the archaeological record keeps nudging us. Why were some wolf remains left whole? Why were they spared? Why were they not butchered like other game? Why did they keep showing up where humans lived? We can't answer that yet, but we can track the pattern. And across dozens of sites, a theme emerges. Presence without violence, proximity without domestication. A long pause before the leap. Later, humans will bury dogs with beads. They will paint them in caves and carve them into bone. But not yet. In this earlier period, there is only the quiet, the glow of firelight, the circle of discarded bones, and a pair of eyes in the dark. The first wolves who stayed close did not know they were starting something. Neither did the humans. There was no plan, no breeding, no taming, just hesitation. And in that hesitation, a new chapter of life on Earth was opening, but it's still too early to call them ours. They were still watching, and we were still being watched. So the question lingers like smoke after the fire has died. What made them stay, and why didn't they strike? Under the cave ceilings and across the scattered riverbanks of Upper Paleolithic Europe, bones began to appear that didn't quite fit. Not fully wolf, not clearly anything else. They had shorter snouts, broader crania, unusual wear patterns on the teeth, and just enough ambiguity to set off a debate that has quietly spanned more than a century. Some were dug up in the 19th century by early paleontologists hunting for mammoths and Pleistocene art. Others emerged only recently with the aid of fine-toothed excavation, isotopic mass spectrometry and ancient DNA. But the mystery remains. What are we actually looking at? And more importantly, are we sure we know what a dog is? This is the problem of definition, and it sits awkwardly at the core of the domestication story. Long before there were leashes or collars or even recognisable breeds, there were canids, whose remains resist neat classification. Many of the sites we'll walk through now have been reanalysed multiple times. Each new generation of scientists has brought better tools, new criteria, and sometimes entirely new conclusions. Some have reclassified what earlier researchers called early dogs as nothing more than regional wolf variants. Others have leaned the opposite way, proposing not just one but multiple independent domestication events based on a handful of skeletal features. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. The further back we look, the harder it gets to draw a line between wolf and dog. One of the most cited early candidates is Goyet Cave, in what is now Belgium. Inside this large limestone cavity, located along the banks of the Samson River, archaeologists uncovered a juvenile canid skull buried among stone tools and butchered reindeer bones. It was dated to around 36,000 years ago, which would make it one of the oldest known dog-like specimens ever discovered. Its short snout and relatively broad cranium seemed, at first, to support this interpretation. But interpretations are fragile things in paleoanthropology. A later analysis questioned whether those traits really meant anything definitive, noting that wolves too, especially juvenile ones, can display a wide range of variation in skull morphology. And so the Goyet skull entered a kind of taxonomic limbo, too weird to be called wolf with certainty, too early and insufficiently modified to be comfortably declared dog. Not far behind in notoriety is the site of Sedmosti in Moravia, part of today's Czech Republic. Here, a cluster of canid skulls with unusually broad muzzles and shortened jaws was unearthed among a dense concentration of human remains, mammoth bones, and stone tools. The age range is murky, but generally placed between 27,000 and 24,000 years ago. Some researchers propose that these skulls represent a morphologically distinct lineage, perhaps a local population of early dogs. Others argued they may be nothing more than wolves selectively culled or processed by humans, given the butchering marks present on several of the mandibles. The real challenge lies in separating intentional breeding from mere environmental variation or dietary effects. Skull shape alone isn't enough. Wolves can change shape based on what they eat, how they live, and what their populations have been through. If a group of wolves scavenged from human settlements for several generations, they might shrink a little, broaden a little, but never cross that invisible line into domestication. One of the more perplexing sites comes from Elisevici in Russia. Dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, this site presents multiple canid remains, some of which have been interpreted as very early dogs. One of the skulls, in particular, has a distinctively shortened snout, reduced carnassial teeth, and what some researchers described as a dog-like profile. But even here, disagreement persists. Later analyses showed that other skulls from the same site don't show the same traits. Some fall squarely within the wild wolf range, others hover at the edges, and none of the DNA results have been conclusive. In fact, DNA extraction from these early Upper Paleolithic specimens is notoriously tricky. Preservation is poor, contamination is high, and because wolves and dogs are so genetically close, more like cousins than distant branches, even high-quality genetic reads often fail to tip the scales one way or another. This brings us to the crux of the problem. Domestication is not a switch. It's not a single mutation or a visible feature that clearly divides wild from tame. It's a spectrum, a process that unfolds slowly across generations, environments, and relationships. In most cases, it begins behaviourally. Only later, much later, do we see consistent morphological changes. But the archaeological record privileges the physical. We're looking for evidence in bones when the real changes may have started in the brain. In the absence of clear genetic lines, researchers have turned to diet as a potential clue. Stable isotope analysis, which examines the ratios of carbon and nitrogen in fossilised bone collagen, can reveal what kinds of foods an animal was eating. If a canid shows a diet similar to nearby humans, especially one rich in fish or cooked starches, that might suggest a degree of human interaction. But again, this is only suggestive. Scavenging wolves could easily mirror a human diet without ever being tamed. And in many Upper Paleolithic sites, that's exactly what we see. A few bones with isotopic values that suggest overlap, but not necessarily partnership. In Przedmosti, for instance, some canids appear to have eaten more reindeer meat than the humans buried nearby, others less. The data is murky, like a half-erased map. So how do we define a dog in this period? Some researchers have tried to codify a list of features: reduced tooth size, shortened snout, crowded premolars, elevated forehead angle. But none of these are definitive. All of them appear occasionally in wild wolf populations. Some appear in captive raised wolves with no breeding selection. Others are influenced by age, sex, or even how the skull was preserved. The result is a frustrating scientific catch-22. We can't define early dogs without knowing what domestication looked like. But we can't define domestication until we know which canids were dogs. And yet, amidst all this ambiguity, there's something strangely comforting. This is how real science works. Slowly, cautiously, willing to be wrong. Every new specimen adds a thread, even if the pattern isn't clear. Every failed DNA extraction, every ambiguous isotope ratio, every skull that seems dog-like until it doesn't. All of it feeds into a picture that is still emerging, still in motion. We may be telling this story thousands of years after it began, but we're still in the middle of it. Some scholars now argue that instead of looking for a single domestication event, we should be looking for zones of interaction. Regions where wolves and humans crossed paths repeatedly over thousands of years. Not just one campfire, but many. Not one domestication, but a slow diffusion of relationships that occasionally tipped into something new. Maybe Goyet, Przedmosti, and Elisevici aren't false starts. Maybe they're different windows into the same long process, unfolding in different ways depending on climate, prey availability, and human mobility. This would mean giving up the idea of a first dog. It would mean accepting that domestication wasn't a moment, but a mosaic. That early dogs didn't all look the same, and they weren't all doing the same thing. Some may have hunted alongside humans, others may have just picked scraps from refuse piles. Some may have been tolerated, others occasionally culled. It was not a simple transition. It was an ecosystem shaped by behaviours we can barely guess at. In the end, the bones we can't be sure about might be telling us the most honest version of the story. Not one of certainty, but of emergence. Not a binary, but a blur. For more than 20,000 years, humans and wolves circled one another, sometimes sharing space, sometimes shaping one another's lives in ways that left only the faintest trace in the archaeological record. Those traces are what we follow now, Not to find the first dog, but to understand how long it took for us to even know what a dog was, and maybe, just maybe, how long it took for them to figure us out too. The camps would have smelled like death. Grease-streaked mammoth bones, the hollow remains of reindeer rib cages, cracked marrow-spattered femurs used as tools and trophies. Around them, stone flake piles, charcoal fire pits, leather drying racks, a few human voices murmuring in the dusk, maybe the sound of children playing in snow-packed corners of the shelter, under the bones of animals twice their size. But for the creatures watching from beyond the firelight, the smell of discarded meat, spoiled fat and shattered sinew would have cut through the cold more sharply than any sound. And those creatures, cautious, hungry, calculating, had choices to make. The model that many researchers now refer to as the self-domestication pathway doesn't start with capture, nor with control. It doesn't even begin with affection. Instead, it begins with proximity. One party discards food, the other quietly appears, and the relationship, if it can be called that yet, proceeds without formal acknowledgement. Around 30,000 to 20,000 years ago, across a patchwork of glacial refugia and a mobile forager territories in Eurasia, a behavioural experiment was already underway, not by design, not by plan, but by cohabitation. A few wolves lingered just a little longer near the edge of human activity, and over time that decision, to stay rather than flee, may have begun to shape not only their evolutionary future, but ours. The core of this theory is behavioural ecology. Not all wolves are the same. Even within a single pack, temperament can vary. Some are bold, some cautious, some more reactive, some more tolerant. In a natural setting, selection may favour the boldest or most coordinated hunters. But in the shadow of a human camp, a different profile may become more successful. A wolf that startles less easily, that tolerates noise, that doesn't rush forward but doesn't bolt at the first scent of smoke either. These wolves wouldn't have needed to interact with humans directly. All they had to do was hang back just enough to avoid being killed, but close enough to benefit from scraps, bones, or refuse. For such individuals, humans would have been less predators and more unwitting providers. What we're describing here is known in ecology as a commensal relationship, one in which one species benefits from the activity of another, while the other remains mostly unaffected. Think of seagulls trailing fishing boats, or raccoons exploring trash bins. For the early wolves who loitered near human encampments, the payoffs could have been considerable. Compared to the unpredictability of hunting elk or red deer across frozen steppe, scavenging from a mammoth carcass already stripped by humans was a low-risk, high-calorie strategy, especially if humans didn't immediately chase you away. Over successive generations, this behavioural tendency, the ability to tolerate human presence, may have had an evolutionary effect. Wolves that fled at the first sign of humans would never get to eat. Wolves that approached too closely or aggressively might be killed. But the middle group, hesitant, observant, patient, had a niche. They weren't friends, but they weren't enemies either. And this ambiguous zone, somewhere between fear and familiarity, may have been the earliest seedbed of domestication. But tolerance alone isn't evolution. For the process to take hold, it must become heritable. This is where things get speculative, but not unreasonable. If the wolves who scavenged near humans survived longer, or reproduced more successfully, their offspring may have inherited some of that tolerance. Over thousands of years, selection could gradually shift the population profile, and if mating patterns were assortative, that is, if tolerant wolves mated preferentially with other tolerant individuals, the behavioural traits could amplify. It wouldn't require human intention, just a feedback loop between environment, behaviour and reproduction. There is historical precedent for this kind of change. The classic example is the silver fox domestication experiment in Russia, where over several decades researchers bred foxes purely for tameness. Within a few generations, the animals not only became calmer and more tolerant of humans, but also developed floppy ears, curled tails, and changes in coat colour, all features seen in domestic dogs. While this was a controlled experiment, it demonstrated how quickly behaviourally linked traits can shift under selective pressure. In a natural environment, it would have taken much longer. But over the span of 10,000 years or more, small behavioural differences can shape entire populations. Some archaeological support for this idea comes not from specific bones, but from spatial patterns. At a few Upper Paleolithic sites, researchers have noted concentrations of canid remains or tooth marks that suggest repeated close proximity between wolves and humans. At Yana RHS in Siberia, dating to roughly 28,000 years ago, several cut-marked wolf bones were found in association with human activity. At sites in what is now the Czech Republic, gnawed bones and coprolites hint at canids feeding on human refuse. None of this proves domestication, but it suggests ongoing entanglement. Not a one-time interaction, but a repeated pattern of mutual navigation, humans disposing, canids scavenging, both adjusting their behaviour slightly in the process. Interestingly, the benefits may not have been entirely one-sided. Even in the earlier stages, humans may have derived some indirect advantage from the presence of these semi-wild camp followers. Scavenging wolves could help clean up waste, reducing odours or pest attraction. Their presence might have discouraged larger carnivores like cave hyenas or saber-toothed cats, and later, if trust deepened, they could alert humans to danger or assist in tracking prey. But these were downstream effects. At the start, it was simply proximity, a quiet co-occupation of space, forged not through planning but through repetition. One important clarification is that this model doesn't require humans to do anything. No capturing, no breeding, no feeding of pups. That would come later. Instead, self-domestication begins with the animals themselves adjusting to a human-created niche. This is in stark contrast to the domestication of livestock like sheep or cattle, which required active human management from the beginning. Dogs, or their pre-dog ancestors, may be unique in this regard. They walked in before they were invited, and eventually they stayed. That decision to stay, or rather to not flee, was not just behavioural. It had genetic consequences, even if slowly. Individuals less reactive to stress hormones with a lower baseline of fear could spend more time near humans and may have been less likely to engage in high-risk conflict. Over time, the neurochemical systems that regulate stress and aggression could begin to shift. The brain begins to rewrite itself, not drastically, but enough. Of course, it's important not to oversell this model. There are critics. Some researchers argue that natural selection alone couldn't account for all the behavioural changes seen in modern dogs. That human-directed selection, even if informal, had to play a role early on. Others point out that the archaeological evidence for long-term cohabitation is still thin, but these are debates about degrees, not fundamentals. Few now doubt that wolves interacted with humans long before formal domestication. The question is how, and how much, those interactions mattered. It's also possible that this process began in more than one place. Across the cold grasslands of the late Pleistocene, humans were scattered in small mobile groups. Wolves were everywhere. In some regions, conditions may have favoured prolonged contact. In others, not. Domestication may have flickered in and out, sparked and then lost. Only in a few places did it persist long enough to become something new. And that brings us to the real lesson of the camp follower model. Domestication is not just a biological process, it's a behavioural negotiation, a long conversation across species, held in the grammar of body language, distance, silence, and scent. It didn't begin with dominance or affection, it began with cohabitation, with two species sharing the same space, eyeing each other warily, and eventually learning that maybe, just maybe, neither one had to leave. The wolves who stayed were not yet dogs, but they were no longer fully wild either. They had entered a new category, one that didn't have a name and still barely does. Not pets, not livestock. Something else. Something that lived between. And for reasons we are still trying to understand, they chose to remain. The haunting question isn't why we took them in. It's why they let us so close in the first place. What happens when the world freezes and neither of us can leave? It was not a night or a season or a decade. It was thousands of winters stacked into each other like driftwood. Around 23,000 years ago, the planet entered its deepest cold in 100 millennia, and it stayed that way for what would feel, to the living, like forever. This was the last glacial maximum, a time when the ice sheet sat over northern Europe like the lid of a sealed box. when the steppes of Central Asia stretched in frozen continuity, barren and hard and barely green, when whole mountain ranges were locked in permanent snow, and the edges of the habitable world squeezed inward like lungs at the end of breath. For humans and wolves alike, movement was no longer freedom. It was danger. It was exposure. It was the edge of the known campfire. We call it the LGM now, as if it were a bureaucratic footnote on the climate timeline. But this was not a paragraph in a book. It was a planetary prison. Rain patterns collapsed. Forests shrank. Deserts expanded. Sea levels dropped by nearly 120 metres, exposing ghostly land bridges between continents. But what matters for this part of the story isn't the coastlines. It's the fact that inland, across Eurasia, two species found themselves boxed into the same ecological corners, and neither of them could afford to move too far from a reliable meal. In most times, wolves and humans would not have shared close space for long. The relationship was, at best, tense opportunism, at worst, predatory competition. Humans were expanding and clever, able to push into new ecological niches. Wolves were already specialists in those niches, and like most large carnivores, they relied on a high rate of mobility. Chase, stalk, track, retreat, move again. But under LGM conditions, that kind of lifestyle was no longer reliable. Herds were dwindling, migration routes were shrinking. The long open plains of the mammoth steppe began to fragment. There was less to follow, and more to risk by following. It is in these kinds of compressed landscapes that something strange begins to show up in the archaeological record. Not everywhere, but in enough places to take notice. The campsites of late Upper Paleolithic humans, especially in regions like the Czech Basin, Ukraine, and parts of Western Russia, begin to show signs of more permanent presence. Hearths with reused ash pits, storage pits cut into permafrost, repeated occupations layered like sediment, and sometimes bones. Bones of large canids, not hunted, not scattered among the prey animals, but present, often incomplete, sometimes carefully placed, sometimes gnawed, always ambiguous. These are not dogs, not yet, but they are also not entirely like wild wolves either. And in the layers of this deep cold, it becomes harder to explain why such animals would remain so close to humans, without fleeing, without attacking, without vanishing. What if they couldn't leave either? The idea that domestication was a linear act, one species taming another through mastery or training, begins to falter here. The LGM does not feel like a laboratory for control. It feels like a trap, for both parties. The humans could not roam like before, and the wolves could not afford to chase prey across empty snow, so they stayed, near each other. Not because of trust, but because of necessity. The self-domestication model often describes early wolves lingering near human camps for food scraps, and in warmer periods, that may well have been the case. But here, during the coldest bottleneck of the Pleistocene, it's possible that something tighter emerged, a kind of mutual proximity, not yet a partnership, but a tolerance. One that might, over thousands of nights, shift into cooperation. What does that look like in practice? A canid following the scent of roasting bone marrow, a human noticing the warning growl when something rustles in the dark, a shared kill site where scavenging turns to patterned returns. We don't have the footage, but we have a few clues. In places like Elisevici in modern-day Russia, sites dated to roughly 20,000 years ago show canid remains that don't quite fit into known wolf morphologies. Their snouts are slightly shorter, their teeth more worn, their bones sometimes appear to have healed from injuries that would have been fatal in the wild. These are not domesticated animals in the modern sense, but they may have been tolerated, even fed, or at the very least not feared enough to be driven off. The same goes for evidence at sites like Předmostí in what is now the Czech Republic. Here, archaeologists have uncovered canid skulls with cranial features that lie somewhere between wolf and dog. Some have speculated about selective breeding. Others argue for dietary stress affecting bone development. Still others suggest hybridization events between wolf populations adapting to human proximity, and others still fully wild. We don't know for sure, and that's part of the point. The LGM doesn't give us clarity. It gives us compression. The climate data tells us that this period was not just cold, it was dry, extremely so. Glaciers tend to lock up vast amounts of water, and with less evaporation, precipitation levels drop. That means less plant growth, which means fewer herbivores, which in turn means hungry carnivores. And yet human populations did not vanish. They adapted. They hunkered down. They began to cluster in resource-rich microclimates, river valleys, geothermal zones, areas with access to both upland and lowland prey. And it's in these kinds of pockets that a repeated pattern may have emerged. Humans making camp, firelight flickering in the distance, and on the edge of vision, watchers. From the animal's perspective, the trade-off becomes simple. Risk getting closer to a species that sometimes throws bones and sometimes throws spears, or risk starvation. From the human side, the calculation may have been just as instinctive. Allow these silent shapes to hang at the edge of camp so long as they do not threaten. And in return, maybe fewer rats, fewer rival scavengers, an extra pair of eyes when the wind picks up. There's no definitive line where tolerance becomes trust. But across enough generations, behaviour can shift. The most skittish animals would not have lingered. The most aggressive would not have been allowed. That leaves a narrow behavioural middle ground. Curiosity, caution. A hunger stronger than fear, but not yet lethal. These are not traits easily tracked in fossil records, but they are selectable. They can be passed on, they can evolve. One of the more subtle clues comes not from bone, but from spacing. In some LGM sites, the spatial distribution of canid remains suggests that they were not butchered in the same zones as prey animals. They appear closer to hearths, sometimes buried, sometimes cached. In a few rare cases, positioned in ways that hint at some kind of intentional placement. This doesn't mean reverence, it doesn't mean companionship, but it may mean recognition. A creature known to the camp, familiar, if not yet family. It is also during this period that we begin to see more complex lithic technologies emerge, microblades, compound tools, hunting strategies that involve logistical planning and delayed returns. This kind of cognitive shift in human behaviour may have paralleled shifts in how other species were perceived, not just as threats, but as potential allies, even if temporary, even if conditional. We have to be careful not to romanticize this. There were no huskies curled at the foot of the fire, no leashes, no names. These were still wild animals, and humans were still struggling through one of the harshest climates in our species' memory. But within that struggle, new relationships may have begun to take root, not in the form of friendship, but in the quiet calculus of survival. The idea that domestication was something done to animals by humans has been challenged over the past few decades. Increasingly, researchers suggest that many domesticated species initiated the process themselves, by choosing to stay, by choosing proximity, and by slowly adapting to the strange, unpredictable world that humans were building. Wolves, more than most, had the cognitive flexibility to do this. Their social structures were already complex, their communication nuanced, their tolerance for cooperative hunting already in place. It would not have taken much, just the right pressures, in the right moment of ecological constraint for the first steps to be taken. But they were not steps toward dogs, not yet. They were just steps away from mutual fear, steps toward coexistence, and maybe, in a few cases, toward cooperation. By 19,000 years ago, the ice had not yet released its grip, but the world was beginning to shift. Pockets of thaw appeared. New prey herds began to move again. Human populations, once trapped in climatic bottlenecks, started to expand outward once more, but they did not leave alone. What began as necessity in the deep cold may have laid the behavioural groundwork for something else, something lasting, something strange, a wolf that did not run, a human that did not strike, and a slow, silent agreement born not of language, but of winter. Not every population of humans would have experienced this, and not every wolf would have stayed, but in a few scattered places, under the pressure of a world sealed in ice, it seems two species stopped seeing each other only as threat, and began, just barely, to see something else. What happens when you trap two predators in the same cage and neither of them wants to die? Maybe you get violence, maybe you get avoidance, but maybe, sometimes, you get evolution. And when the ice finally begins to melt, the question is no longer who stayed, but who left together. They say you can't miss something you've never seen, but science sometimes does exactly that. Not by accident, but by evidence. When a lineage vanishes so completely that not even its bones remain, what's left behind is not silence. It's the outline of something that must have been there, an absence so statistically loud it begins to whisper a name, the wolf that gave us dogs, and then disappeared. We don't know what it looked like, we don't know where it went, but we do know this. All domestic dogs on Earth seem to trace their ancestry to a type of wolf that no longer exists. Not the grey wolves we know today, not the ones howling across modern tundras or skimming the edges of boreal forests. Those are cousins, survivors, but not parents. This mystery doesn't begin in bones, it begins in base pairs. In the early 21st century, genome sequencing began pulling back the veil on domestication timelines. The logic was simple. If you wanted to find the origin point of dogs, compare their DNA to that of wild wolves. The closer the match, the more likely you were getting warmer, but the results kept saying something odd. We weren't getting warmer. In fact, we weren't getting close at all. Across Europe, Asia, and the Arctic, grey wolf populations were sampled, sequenced, and studied. And what researchers kept finding was distance. Dogs didn't fit snugly within any living wolf group. They didn't look like offshoots, they looked like orphans. Their closest known relative wasn't any modern grey wolf, but something else. Something no longer alive. The term for it emerged slowly, a ghost population. In paleogenetics, a ghost population doesn't mean supernatural. It means statistically necessary. It means the genetic evidence we do have, the surviving genome of all living dogs, cannot be fully explained by the wolves we know today. It means there must have been something else, a now extinct wolf, or group of wolves, that split off from the rest long enough to seed the dog lineage, and then, at some point, vanished. The divergence likely began sometime between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, but even that window is blurry. The further back you look, the more gene flow you have to account for. Wolves and dogs weren't completely separate during this period. Interbreeding between the wild and domestic populations didn't stop just because the process of domestication had started. If anything, early dogs were likely merging and mingling with wild wolves repeatedly, making the genetic lines even harder to trace. But here's what makes the ghost wolf theory compelling. If dogs had come from an existing modern lineage of wolves, we would expect to find strong overlap in their mitochondrial DNA, their Y chromosomes, and their autosomal genome. But we don't. What we find instead is consistent genetic distance, ancestral signals that simply don't match anything alive today. That ghost is everywhere, but only in pieces, a puzzle that forms no face. Some of the earliest genome comparisons came from ancient wolves preserved in Siberian permafrost. One such example, known as the Taimyr wolf, lived around 35,000 years ago. Its genome is roughly equidistant to both dogs and modern wolves, suggesting it diverged before domestication began. But again, it's not the direct ancestor. It's a side branch, a cousin. Another clue that the true origin lies somewhere else, somewhere we haven't sequenced, or maybe never will. So what could explain the disappearance? How do you lose the ancestor of one of the most numerous mammalian species on Earth, and lose it so completely that it leaves behind no clear descendants? One possibility is geography. The ghost lineage may have existed in a part of the world where wolves are no longer found, somewhere that experienced massive ecological upheaval at the end of the Ice Age. Central Asia has been proposed as a candidate, so have parts of Eastern Europe, or isolated regions of northern China and Mongolia, places where early human populations were interacting with wild canids around 30,000 years ago, but where today's wolf populations have been heavily altered, reduced, or replaced. Another possibility is simply time. Extinction doesn't always leave bones, it leaves gaps, especially when climate is involved. The last glacial maximum, between roughly 23,000 and 19,000 years ago, was brutal for both humans and animals. Ecosystems shrank, habitats fragmented, prey species declined. It's entirely possible that the wolf population that initially began domesticating itself, or being domesticated, didn't make it through this bottleneck. The ones that did survive may have been the early proto-dogs who clung close to humans, while their wilder kin faded into the snow. The irony, of course, is that the survivor isn't the wild one, it's the one that stayed close to us. Whatever that ghost lineage was, its wild descendants didn't last. Only the ones that began changing, behaviourally, genetically and socially, endured. That's a strange kind of legacy. You evolve just enough to be changed, and then your original form is erased. Not because it was weaker, but because it wasn't part of the new alliance. In a sense, the domesticated lineage outlived its own rootstock, like a grafted branch continuing after the tree is gone. We see hints of this even today. The genetic diversity of modern dogs doesn't neatly mirror that of modern wolves. Dogs, despite their population explosion, often carry less diversity in certain parts of their genome. That's what you'd expect from a bottleneck, or from founding populations that emerge from a now-lost subset of wolves. A study published in the early 2020s pushed this even further. Using improved ancient DNA extraction techniques, researchers found that even when looking at Ice Age wolves from across Europe and Siberia, none of them seemed to be the precise ancestor of dogs, not even the ones temporally close to the divergence. Again and again the story repeated, close, but not it. Almost, but not quite. The genetic shadow of the ghost wolf was still there, but only by contrast. What this tells us is that dog domestication isn't a neat arrow. It's not one wolf, one human, one moment in time. It's a foggy convergence, a slow drift between populations, climates and behaviours, all swirling together in a pattern we can mostly infer only from what came next. The genetic fingerprint of that ghost lineage may be scattered across dozens of ancient canids, each holding a shard of something we can't reassemble. And here's where humility steps in. For all our sequencing power and computational models, we still don't know what species of wolf gave rise to dogs. We may never know. It may not have been a species in the way we define it today, but rather a loose population with shared behavioural traits, tameness, social flexibility, food tolerance, that favoured its entanglement with humans. And once that entanglement began, natural selection likely took it the rest of the way. But selection doesn't preserve the past, it shapes the future, and in doing so it erases the paths not taken. The wild ghost of domestication may be one of those paths, a branch that flowered just long enough to touch us, and then vanished. What's strange is that we carry it with us. Every dog on Earth is a living artefact of something we cannot reconstruct, a fossil in motion, a memory without a skeleton. The ghost wolf is gone, but the creature it helped create has colonized the planet, and it still curls beside our fires, thousands of years later. Which brings us to the haunting question. If the animal that gave us dogs no longer exists, what else have we built our lives around that we no longer remember? How many relationships in human history began with a glance, a quiet tolerance, a proximity, and then continued for so long that we forgot where they began? The past is not full of answers. It is full of questions shaped like animals, some still breathing, some still watching, and some that, like the ghost wolf, exist only because we noticed the space they left behind. It begins quietly, not with a skull or a burial, not even with a footprint, but with a pattern, a shape buried in the code of life. Somewhere in the stretch of cold millennia between 23,000 and 15,000 years ago, something irreversible began to appear in the genomes of certain canids. Something that made them different, not by the way they looked, not yet, but by the long cellular memory of where they'd been, and who they had followed. For a long time, there was no reason to expect that this divergence had already happened. When archaeologists found bones, they debated them. When museums catalogued skulls, they tried to measure them, and for a while, that was enough. If a jaw looked short enough, or a snout looked compact enough, or a tooth showed signs of wear from chewing something other than raw bone, it might be labelled. Maybe a dog, maybe not. The problem wasn't in the evidence, it was in the expectations. But then we began to sequence them. In the early decades of the 21st century, ancient DNA became readable in ways no previous generation could have imagined. Suddenly, teeth and petrous bones weren't just artifacts, they were data. And inside that data was something nobody had predicted. The split between the ancestors of dogs and the ancestors of modern wolves had already happened long before the oldest undisputed dog burials were even dug, long before leashes, long before loyalty was mythologized. The genomes had already parted ways. This wasn't just a coincidence of lineage. It wasn't a vague drift or a quirk of regional variation. It was a rupture, subtle but detectable, in the evolutionary paths of canids who would become wolves and canids who would become something else entirely. What the genomes show, and what they continue to suggest with increasing resolution, is that by somewhere around 23,000 years ago, perhaps slightly earlier, there was already a population of ancient canids whose descendants would never return to the wild. These were not yet dogs in the full sense of the word. Their ears may have still stood alert. Their coats were likely wild and thick. Their instincts were still honed for independence. But something had already changed. Genetically, they had started to form a distinct population, a group moving slowly along a different track. We call this coalescence. In population genetics, coalescence refers to the moment in the past when the lineages of different genes trace back to a shared ancestor. Imagine walking backward through a dense forest of DNA, every footstep a generation. At first, everything seems scattered, branches going in all directions. But if you go back far enough, certain trails begin to meet, and eventually they join. That's where we find the coalescence point. In the case of dogs and wolves, many of these trails converge during that cold window between 23 and 15,000 years ago. What's strange, and still debated, is how quickly it happened, and how early. Because the first real signs of domesticated dog behaviour in the archaeological record come much later. Yet here, in the molecular record, the split is already unmistakable. So either we've been looking in the wrong places, or what we think of as domesticated behaviour took longer to appear than the genes that allowed it. What's more, when researchers began comparing these ancient canid genomes to those of modern wolves, a different problem emerged. The ancestry didn't match. Dogs, genetically, did not descend from any wolf population still alive today. They split off from something else, something older, something that has since vanished. In other words, the wolf that gave us dogs is gone. This is not a rhetorical mystery. It's a statistical one. Every time scientists try to match the DNA of ancient and modern canids, they find the same gap. The wolves we see today, from Arctic tundras to Himalayan valleys, are close, but not quite right. They are not the sisters or brothers of that first domesticated lineage. They're cousins. The ancient ancestor that dogs branched from is no longer with us. It's what geneticists sometimes call a ghost population, a lineage that must have existed to explain the genetic structure we see, but that has no direct modern representative. It left its legacy behind in one direction only, in dogs. We don't know when this ghost lineage disappeared. It may have been gradual, as isolated populations of early wolves shrank under climatic or ecological pressure, or it may have happened later when more modern wolf populations expanded and replaced older ones. It's possible this ancestral wolf was already rare by the time humans began spreading across the continents. It's even possible, though far from confirmed, that our growing partnership with its more social offspring indirectly contributed to its decline. But we simply don't know. We can only trace the shape of what it left behind. The evidence for this divergence grows more compelling with every high-coverage genome sampled from prehistoric dogs and wolves. Some of the oldest known dog genomes, sequenced from animals that lived nearly 15,000 years ago, already show the same split. Their lineage is already distinct from modern wolves. This means that the genetic divergence must have happened well before their time, likely during the depth of the last glacial maximum, or even earlier. These animals weren't on the path to becoming dogs. They already were, at least at the genetic level. Yet what's equally important is that this doesn't look like a one-time event. The divergence doesn't point to a single founding pair or a sudden leap into domesticity. Instead, it looks like a gradual process, an ongoing drift, shaped by natural selection, environmental pressures, and probably a lot of trial and error. Early humans likely encountered many types of wolves. Some may have followed camps and tolerated firelight. Others may have kept their distance or vanished from the story entirely. The canids that eventually became dogs were just one thread among many, but it was the one that endured. In these ancient genomes, researchers also find something else: signs of structure. The early dog population wasn't a uniform block. Even in the period shortly after the split, there were already differences among groups, differences that reflected both geography and behaviour. Some early dog lineages show more genetic continuity with Western Eurasia, others with the East. Some carry traces of ancient admixture from now extinct wolf lineages, others appear more isolated. What this means is that dog domestication wasn't a single event in a single place. It was a process, a cloud of interlocking relationships shifting across time and terrain. But all of them, without exception, trace back to that same invisible ancestor. And this is where the mystery deepens. If we can no longer find this ancestral wolf, then how do we describe it? What made it different from the wolves that survived? Was it smaller, more social, better adapted to marginal environments near human settlements? Did it differ in ways we can't see in the bones, neurological traits, hormonal balances, metabolic quirks? Or was it, perhaps, not all that different at all? Just a few mutations here or there, made meaningful only by their interaction with us. It's easy to imagine that we selected this wolf, that we saw something in it, a kindness, a calmness, a spark, and invited it closer. But the evidence doesn't support that kind of fairy tale, at least not yet. More likely, this was mutual drift, a dance without choreography, a slow parallel path that began in the coldest millennia of the Ice Age, when both species were stretched thin and looking for warmth. The wolves who stuck around long enough, and whose children did the same, found themselves shaping a new evolutionary path without ever knowing it. And then, eventually, the rest of their kind was gone. What's left is not just a genetic absence, it's a silence, a branch of the tree that once shaded the edges of our campsites, and now survives only in the bark of a domestic descendant. Dogs carry it quietly, in the folding of their ears, the slope of their skulls, and the genes that now let them digest starch, read human gestures, and wag their tails without fear. But none of it leads us back to the wild ancestor. That trail is broken, so we are left with this. The wolf that gave us dogs no longer walks the earth. And in a way, that makes every dog alive today not just a companion, but a fossil with a heartbeat, a memory in motion, a quiet genetic echo of something we can no longer find in the forests. We don't know where it died out. We don't know if it faded quietly into the background, or if its last populations howled from hills now covered in snow and time. But we do know what it left behind, not a monument, not a skeleton, but a relationship, and perhaps that's enough, because the genomes won't let us forget. They keep pointing backward, reminding us that the domestication story didn't start with us. It started with a lineage that disappeared so completely, we only know it existed because the DNA can't stop showing us what's missing. So the question lingers, why does the wolf that gave us dogs no longer exist? And perhaps even harder to answer, what might we have learned from it if it had stayed? They could have left it behind. In a world of hunger, cold, and constant movement, Ice Age humans made difficult decisions every day. A sick puppy, barely 6 months old, wouldn't have stood a chance on its own. Its jaw was deformed. It had suffered from a likely case of canine distemper, a virus that would have left it feverish, weak, and unable to eat for weeks at a time, and yet someone kept it alive, fed it, protected it, waited through its relapses, until finally it died. And then someone buried it. The grave was found near what is now Bonn, in western Germany. The year was 1914, and archaeologists excavating a gravel pit in Oberkassel came across something strange. 2 human skeletons, a man and a woman, buried side by side. Nearby, red ochre had been scattered, a familiar marker of symbolic burial. But there was more. Tucked beside the humans in the same grave lay the skeleton of a dog. This animal is often called the earliest unequivocal domesticated dog in the archaeological record. Its features are no longer wolf-like. Its genetic profile doesn't match wild populations. It shows clear signs of intentional care. But more than that, it was buried with people, not eaten, not discarded, not merely tolerated. It was mourned. and that changes everything. To understand why this grave is so important, we have to go back nearly 15,000 years. Europe was still thawing from the last glacial maximum. Forests had not yet returned in full, but the harshest period of ice and cold had passed. Reindeer, horse and red deer roamed the steppe tundra, and humans followed them. These were late Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, likely belonging to what we now call the Fedemesser or Azelian cultures, though such labels are often blurred. They moved in small groups, relied on complex foraging strategies, and carried with them not just tools and weapons, but stories, rituals and companions, apparently including dogs. The puppy at Bon Oberkassel was young, its teeth not yet fully erupted. A close examination of its remains revealed something astonishing. It had suffered from at least 2 distinct episodes of distemper, spaced several weeks apart. During each, it would have been unable to eat on its own, likely vomiting, dehydrated and lethargic. Survival was unlikely. The only explanation based on the pathology was human care. Someone must have fed it by hand, protected it from predators, nursed it through a viral illness that most modern animals don't survive even with veterinary help. And this was no isolated dog tossed into the dirt. The grave itself was formal, even delicate. The humans and the dog were positioned together. There are signs that the pit was carefully filled. Red ochre dust, a pigment often associated with symbolic meaning, was sprinkled throughout the grave. The implication is hard to avoid. This dog was not just an animal. It was part of the human group, perhaps even part of the human family. But why? Why go to such lengths for a sick animal that offered no immediate survival benefit? The answer may lie in the timing. By this period, something had clearly shifted in the relationship between humans and canids. Genetic evidence, not our focus here but still important, suggests that dogs had already diverged from their wild cousins. Morphologically, this puppy had features not seen in wolves: a shorter snout, smaller teeth, and crucially a behavioural disposition that must have made it more tolerant of humans, less fearful, more cooperative. These traits weren't just random. They were selected generation by generation through something deeper than ownership, through coexistence. In the past, scholars sometimes assumed that domestication was a top-down process. Humans, the presumed masters, captured wild animals and bred them into usefulness. But finds like Bon Oberkassel suggest something else, something slower and more mutual. By 15,000 years ago, humans weren't simply tolerating wolves. They were living with dogs, and they were grieving them. Still, not everyone agrees on the interpretation. Some have argued that the burial may have been accidental, that the dog crawled into the grave later, or that it was merely a useful tool, perhaps a hunting companion, and its presence in the grave doesn't imply affection. But these counter-arguments struggle under the weight of the evidence. The pathology alone is telling. You don't nurse a hunting tool through distemper. You don't cradle a failed asset in a human grave. Something else was going on. And it wasn't just Bonn. Other sites from this broad time range show similar patterns, though none quite so clear. In parts of France, Belgium, and the Czech Republic, canid remains appear in human contexts. Some are ambiguous. Some may represent early stages of domestication, but only Bon Oberkassel gives us all the pieces: a genetically distinct animal, a healed sickness, and a formal burial with humans. Even more intriguing is what this burial does not show. It doesn't present the dog as a utility. There is no harness, no weapon, no indication of a ritual sacrifice. Instead, it presents the dog as a life, a short, painful, cared-for life, that ended in the arms of others, that was in some sense grieved. What we glimpse here is not the origin of dogs. That had already happened. Somewhere, centuries or millennia before, the process had begun. The genes had shifted, the behaviour had changed, the line had split. But this moment, this grave, marks something else. Not biology, not utility, but meaning. It suggests that by 15,000 years ago, humans and dogs weren't just surviving together. They were bonding, emotionally, symbolically, perhaps even spiritually. It's tempting to romanticize this, to imagine Ice Age children playing with puppies, or hunters relying on loyal companions in the snow. And perhaps that happened. But what matters here is not fantasy, but fact. And the facts are these. A young animal survived a deadly illness, likely through care. It was buried with two humans, and its remains show features consistent with domestication. That is what we know. What we don't know is where this relationship started, or why, or how many times humans tried it before it stuck. We don't know if the dog was considered a sacred creature, or simply a loved one. We don't know its name if it had one. We don't know who fed it in the final days or who cried when it died. We only know that they did not leave it behind. And perhaps that's the deeper meaning of this grave. It isn't a beginning, it's a signpost. A fossilized whisper of something already underway. A clue that, somewhere along the freezing paths of late Paleolithic Europe, humans had begun to see another species not as threat or prey or tool, but as companion, as kin. What changed to make this possible? Was it the environment, pressing both species into cooperation? Was it a behavioural quirk in some wolves that made them linger longer by human fires? Was it children, sneaking scraps to quiet pups when no one was looking? The truth is we don't know, and that's the honest heart of science. We do not begin with certainty. We begin with bones, and this one, buried in the loam of Western Europe 15,000 years ago, still speaks. It speaks of care in a cruel world, of connection across a species divide, of something delicate, improbable, and real. Something we now call friendship. But what did they call it then? And how many more graves like this lie waiting in the earth? It wasn't just in Bonn. That one grave, with its carefully placed puppy alongside two humans, might have become the poster child for dog domestication, but it was not alone. Across the late Upper Paleolithic world, between roughly 15,000 and 12,000 years before the present, something strangely consistent began happening. In France, in Israel, in what is now Switzerland, in northern and southern Italy. Human communities, disconnected by language, climate and terrain, began doing the same odd thing. They buried dogs, not as waste, not out of ritual necessity, but with care, often alongside themselves. Which raises a very uncomfortable question. Why did so many humans, from so many different places, all start treating these animals in almost the exact same way? Were they imitating one another? Were they reacting to a shared set of social or emotional needs? Or had the partnership with wolves, or proto-dogs, reached some kind of threshold by then? A point where the relationship, once practical or opportunistic, became something deeper, more symbolic, something recognisably close. Archaeology, of course, cannot give us the feelings behind a burial, but it can give us clues about behaviour, and sometimes even patterns. And the pattern that emerges here is oddly uniform. It is not just that people started burying dogs. It is that they buried them carefully, sometimes ornamentally, and almost always within close proximity to human remains. That, in the eyes of archaeological classification, suggests a major shift in perception, from tolerated scavenger to valued presence to something else, something worthy of ceremony. In southern France, at the site of Mont-Lazerat, the remains of a dog were found in direct association with a human grave dated to roughly 13,000 years ago. The animal's bones showed clear signs of old injuries that had healed, and isotopic analysis suggested a human-like diet heavy in cooked or processed meat. This dog had not merely wandered into a burial pit, it had been deliberately placed there. Some interpretations argue it may have been buried at the same time as its human counterpart. Others leave open the possibility of separate timing, but the proximity is undeniable. Someone decided it belonged there. Roughly 2,000 kilometres away in northern Israel, a site called Ein Malahah, dated to approximately 12,000 years ago, contains one of the more poignant examples. There, in a Natufian burial pit, the skeleton of an elderly woman was found resting with her hand placed directly over the body of a small dog. Both bodies had been buried in a flexed position, and the positioning of the woman's arm suggests that the dog was not simply placed in the grave as an afterthought. The two had been arranged together, with intention. Radiocarbon dating places the burial well before the advent of agriculture in the region. This was not yet a society of farms or permanent herders. It was still, technically, a foraging world, and yet they were burying dogs like family. Further north, in what is now Switzerland, excavations at the site of Oberkassel have revealed dog remains from the same general time window, many of them with pathological indicators of long-term human care. Some of these animals appear to have lived with injuries or diseases that would have made survival in the wild effectively impossible. One had a malformed jaw that would have prevented efficient biting or scavenging. Another showed signs of a chronic spinal issue. In both cases, survival implied sustained feeding and protection. Someone, or some group, had kept these animals alive despite their inability to fend for themselves. That is not behaviour easily explained by utility alone. It's important to remember that these burials all predate the standardisation of animal domestication seen later in the Neolithic. There were no barns, no corrals, no organised breeding for traits. These animals were not livestock, and they weren't meat reserves. They were something else. Companions, perhaps, or spiritual symbols, or social mirrors. The precise role is still debated, but what is not debated is the shift. By this point in time, across widely spaced regions, humans had begun to include these animals in their mortuary rituals. That is a powerful indicator of social meaning. In Italy, the site of Grotta Romanelli in Apulia yielded dog remains buried in stratigraphic contexts associated with human tools and ornaments from the late Epigravettian period, around 12,000 years ago. The remains had been placed with a care that strongly suggests intentional burial. Taphonomic analysis showed no evidence of butchery or exposure. The dogs had not been eaten. They had been buried intact and with positioning that mirrored human interments nearby. Again, the question looms, why? Some researchers have proposed that these burials may reflect a symbolic recognition of shared suffering. In the unpredictable climate swings at the end of the last ice age, life was brutal not just for humans, but for any creature trying to coexist with them. Scarcity, migration, cold. The dogs, if we can call them that, who stuck with humans may have endured the same collapses, famines, and social disruptions. Burying them in this light may have served as a kind of acknowledgement. A small, quiet signal that these were not tools. They were witnesses. Others have proposed a more practical explanation, that dogs, even at this early stage, served as hunting companions or campsite guardians, and that their burial represents gratitude or cultural ritual. It is possible. But in many of these cases, the dogs in question were young, old, or infirm. Hardly the most useful members of a hunting band. The Bon puppy, after all, had been sick for weeks before its death. The Enmalaha dog had a spinal deformity. These weren't tools, they were something else entirely. There's also the question of simultaneous development. It is possible, of course, that these burial practices emerged independently in different parts of the world, as humans and wolves converged into something new. The archaeological record supports that possibility, but it is also conceivable that ideas about dogs, as protectors, as family, as kin, began to travel along with humans themselves, just as tool technologies spread. Perhaps this behaviour did too, slowly, over fire, in whispers. Bury them, they stayed. A third possibility lingers too, that what we are seeing is not cultural imitation or convergence, but simply an emotional inevitability. That living alongside another creature over generations through hunger and cold eventually produces attachment. Not universal, not total, but enough. Enough to lay the body gently, enough to remember, enough to dig a second grave when the first wasn't big enough. Some behaviours don't need to be taught, they only need time. We are not claiming certainty. That would be the opposite of science, but the pattern is real. Between 15,000 and 12,000 years ago, the world began to soften in small ways. Glaciers pulled back, forests crept north, and in the quiet between tempests, humans began to do something strange and unprecedented. They started burying animals alongside themselves, not as food, not as offerings, but as companions, repeatedly, gently, sometimes even ornamentally. In the decades ahead, more of these burials will likely be found. Taphonomy is imperfect, and bone preservation is always uneven. But already the archaeological signal is strong enough to suggest a shift in how humans saw these animals. Whether through spiritual metaphor, emotional attachment, or something more practical but equally profound, the status of wolves, now turning slowly into dogs, was changing. No longer just tolerated, not yet fully tamed, but chosen, again and again. And perhaps the most haunting part of it all is that this shift did not happen in one place. it happened in many, with no empire, no social media, no religious mandate to enforce it. It came from the ground up, from grief, from loyalty, or maybe just from routine. A presence at the camp, a bark at the stranger, a head resting in the lap of a dying elder. And then, one day, a decision. Dig 2 graves instead of 1. We don't know the words they used. We don't know the reasons they whispered. But we know what they did. And it tells us that long before we invented breeds or collars or leashes, something had already changed. We were no longer alone, and neither were they. Why did so many groups so far apart start bearing dogs the same way? Maybe it wasn't a mystery. Maybe it was the beginning of memory. In the high, frozen corridors of northern Asia, where mammoth bones once outnumbered trees, a different kind of experiment may have been unfolding. Not a conscious one, not a planned one, but an evolutionary entanglement nonetheless. Quiet, trudging, and unclear. While much of the world looks westward toward Europe's iconic Paleolithic burials or south toward the Levant's cultural hearths, Siberia was quietly keeping its own secrets under permafrost, and some of them may concern the dog, or something like it. This stretch of the Upper Paleolithic, spanning the last 20,000 years before the Holocene, is not known for delicacy. These were lean years, especially in the north. The last glacial maximum had peaked. The land was not welcoming. Enormous steppe bison, reindeer, and woolly rhinoceros still roamed, barely, and behind them, the mammoth hunters. People who did not yet farm. People who knew the wind too well. People who moved with the ice edge and left behind flint shards, broken antlers, burnt bone, and, in a few strange cases, canids. It is in this context that we find one of the most quietly controversial archaeological questions in the dog origin story. Were wolves, or their not quite domesticated descendants, already sharing some kind of behavioural tether with humans here in Siberia, long before dogs were dogs? Or are we just mistaking a few odd skulls for companionship? Start with Doghistory Cave. Buried in the Aldan highlands of eastern Siberia, this site was excavated in the 1970s and became the namesake of the broader Doghistory cultural complex, a late Paleolithic tradition defined by bifacial tools, wedge-shaped cores, and distinct microblade technologies. It's important not because of what we know with certainty, but because of what it suggests. Among the recovered remains was a canid skull, interpreted by some early researchers as belonging to an early domesticated dog. But the morphology was ambiguous. Its cranial features, particularly the snout length and brain case shape, fell somewhere between wolf and dog, and without clear contextual burial or associated human treatment, the designation remained tentative. Some still refer to it as a proto-dog. Others caution that the line between small, gracile wolves and large early dogs is far too thin to draw confidently, especially from one skull. Then there is Afontova. This site, near Krasnoyarsk on the Yenisei River, spans multiple layers and occupations, with some cultural deposits dating as far back as 20,000 years ago. In addition to the human remains and extensive mammoth bone assemblages, researchers discovered canid material that again drew speculation. A skull from Afontova was once suggested to belong to a domesticated dog, or at least a transitional form. This time, the argument rested on cranial shortening and dentition patterns that suggested a move away from hypercarnivory. But again, caution crept in. Without accompanying genome data, and with the vast morphological variation even within modern wolves, assigning such a critical identity to fossilised bone remains difficult. Some researchers have argued that the supposed dog-like features may reflect nothing more than regional wolf variation. Cold-adapted, possibly semi-sedentary, and perhaps simply underfed. Which brings us to one of the most intriguing and controversial sites, Razbunitsa Cave. Located in the Altai Mountains, this site has delivered some of the best preserved Paleolithic canid material anywhere, thanks to its sheltered position and stable temperature. In 2011, a team analysing a canid skull from this cave proposed that it represented an early domesticated dog, possibly dating to around 33,000 years ago. That would make it older than any unambiguous dog remains in the world. The basis for this claim was a suite of cranial and dental features, including a shortened snout, smaller carnassials, and reduced tooth crowding, all of which are consistent with the early stages of domestication, or at least directional selection toward neotenous traits. But there's a problem, a few actually. First, the dating is stratigraphic and indirect. The specimen was not directly dated, only the surrounding deposits. Second, no human remains or occupation evidence were found directly associated with the skull. If this was a domesticated dog, where were its humans? Third, follow-up studies have questioned the morphological distinctiveness of the Razbonichia skull, suggesting that it may fall within natural wolf variation after all, or that it reflects a now extinct Pleistocene wolf lineage with traits we don't fully understand. Which leads to the broader question, are we finding early dogs in Siberia, or are we simply uncovering a forgotten diversity of ancient wolves, some of whom, by pure coincidence or convergent ecology, looked dog-like? The distinction is not minor. If these animals were indeed early dogs, then domestication, or at least pre-domestication entanglement, was underway in Northeast Asia independently of the better-known Western examples. That would support a model of multiple domestication attempts, or perhaps even multiple successes, later streamlined by migration and population bottlenecks. But if not, then we are simply peering into the lost world of Ice Age wolf evolution, a world that was far more diverse than we had imagined. To complicate matters further, some of these same sites have produced evidence of human behaviour that hints at deeper connections. At Afontova Gora, some tools appear to have been fashioned from canid bones. At Deeptime, the proximity of the canid remains to hearth features, and human refuse layers has raised questions. Were these wolves following human camps, scavenging like shadowy camp followers? Were they tolerated, or hunted? It is difficult to say. There are no ceremonial burials of canids here, no paw prints fossilised in ancient mud beside human footprints, no collars, no offerings, no certainty. What we do have is ecological plausibility. The mammoth steppe was not a place where many species could survive alone. Humans had to follow the herds. Wolves had to follow something. If humans represented a more predictable source of bone scraps, warmth and protection from other predators, it's not impossible that some wolves, just a few perhaps, began hovering closer. Just enough to not be a threat. Just far enough not to be chased. That's not domestication, but it is proximity. And proximity is how things begin. The Siberian record may not give us dogs, but it gives us something else. A mirror. These canids, whether wolves, proto-dogs or lost cousins, were navigating the same climates, the same prey shortages, the same frozen rivers and collapsing glaciers as the humans they shadowed. And in some cases, they appear to have done so for thousands of years. If this was not yet partnership, it was at least parallelism. So when we ask whether dogs evolved beside mammoth hunters, not farmers, the answer may depend on what we mean by evolved. The genetic evidence we'll explore later suggests that true domestication may have occurred elsewhere, or later, or both. But behaviourally, the seeds may have been here. In the long twilight of the Pleistocene, under low Siberian skies, when two species learned to read each other's movements, not out of affection, but out of need. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that's all it ever was, at first. A mutual alignment of survival tactics refined not through intent but inertia. The wolves who lingered without lunging. The humans who didn't throw the first stone, neither one planning the future, just watching each other, just waiting for the next mammoth to fall. As we move forward, these Siberian threads will begin to connect, or unravel, depending on which part of the world we follow next. But for now, all we can say is that something was happening here, and that the bones in the frost are watching us just as closely as we are watching them. Somewhere near the end of the world, the ice made a bridge. Not a bridge of stone or wood, but of wind-packed snow and frozen silence. Beringia, a continent that wasn't quite a continent. A place that once connected what we now call Siberia and Alaska, though neither name would have meant anything to the people who crossed it, or to the four-legged shadows that followed them. Roughly between 16,000 and 12,000 years ago, as the great glaciers began their slow retreat, bands of humans made their way eastward into what we now call the Americas. This was not a single wave or a clear migration. It was messy, slow, and stretched over generations. Some may have lingered on the exposed plains of Barinia for centuries before pushing farther. Others may have never crossed at all. But what has become increasingly clear is that wherever humans went, something padded closely behind. Dogs, or more precisely proto-dogs. Wolves that were no longer quite wolves. Their genomes had already begun to diverge from their untamed ancestors, and according to several genetic studies, this split had occurred before humans ever stepped foot on American soil. The dogs didn't arrive after the humans, they arrived with them. This is not just a footnote in migration history, it is a clue, one that forces us to rethink the timeline of human-animal relationships and the depth of interspecies bonds long before cities, farms, or even permanent shelters. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ushki Lake in Kamchatka and the Yukon ice margins suggest that by the time early human groups reached these frozen thresholds, canid remains were already present, some showing signs of human association, others still too ambiguous to classify. The bones themselves are not always diagnostic. Crania are crushed, teeth are weathered. Context is patchy, but the genetic evidence has started filling in what the bones cannot say clearly. By comparing the nuclear DNA of ancient American dogs to those found in Siberia, researchers have traced a shared ancestry that predates the peopling of the Americas. These animals did not descend from North American wolves. Their lineage was already distinct. Their presence, in other words, cannot be explained by local taming. It must have been carried not in arms perhaps, but in footsteps, in shared hunts, in watchful eyes around campfires lit in the bitter dark of the far north. What we are seeing here is not an accident of companionship. It is co-dispersal, a movement through ice and time in parallel. What drove it? We still don't know. Perhaps the dogs offered warmth, alarm calls, assistance in tracking prey. Perhaps the humans offered food scraps, shelter, and, intentionally or not, a breeding environment that favoured sociability over aggression. But whatever the mechanics, the pattern is clear. These animals were not just tolerated, they were taken. Or maybe they took the humans. The implications go deeper. If dogs entered the Americas at the same time as humans, it means that the dog-human partnership was robust enough to endure the brutal ecological bottleneck of Beringia. It means these proto-dogs had already been selected, consciously or not, for traits that made them suitable travel companions. Endurance, tolerance, affinity for human presence. It means the relationship was older than the continents it reached. It also suggests that domestication, as a process, did not require settled life. These were not farmers in the Fertile Crescent slowly breeding out aggression from livestock. These were Ice Age foragers moving across a land that doesn't even exist anymore, accompanied by animals that chose the same path. There is, of course, the lingering question of why this early dog lineage later disappeared from much of the Americas. Later arrivals, including European colonists, brought new dog lineages that outcompeted or replaced the earlier ones. But for a time, the first dogs of the Americas were something distinct, a parallel echo of the bond that had already begun to define human expansion. The bridge they crossed is now drowned under the Bering Sea. Nothing of it remains above water, but the story it carried, of two species moving as one, still flickers in the genomes of ancient remains and the shadows of camps long buried under tundra. No one left a map, no one marked the trail, but they walked it together, and we are only just beginning to understand how far they went. There are ghosts in the genetic record, not the metaphorical kind, but the kind that once had warm blood, thick fur, and a place by the fire. Dogs that ran alongside the first humans to ever set foot in the Americas. Dogs that crossed frozen land bridges, curled up in skin tents, gnawed bones in the dark. And yet, almost all of them are gone. Not physically buried, though many were, but genetically erased. A lineage almost lost. As far as we can tell, the first dogs to enter the Americas came not long after humans did, perhaps even alongside them. Their story begins somewhere in northeastern Siberia, in that ambiguous time just before 16,000 years ago, when humans began inching their way across Beringia, a vast Ice Age land bridge that connected what is now Russia and Alaska. These first people brought with them more than stone tools and mammoth hunting skills. They brought canids, and those canids left a genetic fingerprint we can still just barely detect. One particular lineage, known today by geneticists as a 2B, tells this story. It is a mitochondrial haplogroup, a branch of the maternal genetic tree passed from mother to offspring. It appears, faint but unmistakable, in some of the oldest confirmed dog remains found in North America. Sites like Hines Cave in Texas, Dust Cave in Alabama, and Modoc Rock Shelter in Illinois have all yielded the bones of dogs that carried this signature. They date roughly from 15,000 to 10,000 years ago. And then, very nearly, the signature disappears. The extinction of the A2B lineage is not a mystery with a single cause. Rather, it is the result of multiple waves of cultural, ecological and biological change, some subtle and others cataclysmic. But before we lose the thread, let us consider what this lineage meant while it still thrived. The early American dogs were not all alike. Some were large, others small. Some looked more like wolves. Others had the shorter snouts and crowded teeth typical of later domesticated dogs. Their diets, revealed through isotopic analysis, suggest they lived on scraps of human food, cooked meat, fish, and in some cases starchy plant material. In a few sites, their remains are buried in human-associated contexts. They were not just tolerated. They were companions, co-workers, possibly even protectors. But they were also something more. They were part of the biocultural system that defined early life in the Americas. To call these dogs indigenous is not merely symbolic. They adapted to the unique ecological niches of North America long before any other domesticated species arrived. Their presence shaped, and was shaped by, the societies they lived with. They helped haul loads, guard camps, hunt, and likely participated in ritual and spiritual life. Yet they left behind no written legacy, only bones and fading strands of mitochondrial DNA. Then, at some point, they began to vanish, gradually at first, and then almost entirely. The arrival of later dogs, brought by European colonists many millennia later, may have overwhelmed these native lineages through interbreeding. Others may have died out due to changing lifestyles, diseases, or shifting ecological conditions. What remains today in the genomes of modern American dogs is a near-total replacement. The A2B lineage has become almost a whisper, surviving only in isolated ancient samples and rare fragments. And this raises a question. Why did America's original dogs disappear? Was it mere genetic drift, the statistical erosion of a small population over time? Was it biological displacement by more robust or better adapted dogs introduced later? Or does the disappearance reflect something deeper? A cultural loss, parallel to the erasure of indigenous human traditions and knowledge systems that once valued these dogs not just as tools, but as kin? There is no single answer. The current evidence suggests a mix of all three. But the fact that these early dogs were so thoroughly erased genetically speaks to the vulnerability of domesticated species when tied so closely to human lifeways. When cultures collapse or transform under pressure, their animals often vanish with them. It is a reminder that domestication is not just a biological process. It is a social contract, one that must be renewed in each generation, or lost. Today, scientists continue to sequence ancient dog DNA from sites across the Americas, hoping to map out the full story of A2B and its relatives. With each new bone, each new analysis, a little more of the picture sharpens. But we are chasing ghosts. And while genetics can tell us something about their bodies, it can tell us almost nothing about how they lived, what they meant to the people they followed, or the quiet companionship they might have offered beneath the pines, on long, cold hunts, when mammoths still wandered the plains. This is what we know. The dogs that entered the Americas with the first humans belonged to a distinct maternal lineage now nearly extinct. They adapted, they thrived, and then somehow they vanished. And perhaps the haunting part is not that they disappeared. Species come and go all the time. The haunting part is that we almost forgot they existed at all. They were here. They mattered. And we're only just beginning to listen again. It is hard to talk about extinction when it does not leave a crater. No bones scattered across the steppe. No final eruption or vanishing star. Just a slow fading of something once so ordinary it was barely noticed. Somewhere between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, as human groups continued to spread across the Americas, the earliest dogs of this continent moved with them. They carried fire in their nostrils, slept under mammoth hides, and crossed rivers beside human children who did not yet know the word domestication. And yet, the dogs that arrived first, a lineage now called a 2B, are almost entirely gone. Not just reduced, not just outcompeted, nearly erased. This ancient haplogroup, identified through mitochondrial DNA, traces back to the very earliest canine arrivals in the Americas. These weren't the wolves of the plains or hybrid newcomers from later Eurasian imports. These were the native dogs of ancient hunters, the ones who helped carry meat, shared camps, and maybe even warned of danger in the night. Their origin appears to tie them to an ancient Northeast Asian source population, crossing the Bering Land Bridge not long after the last glacial maximum, somewhere between 16,000 and 12,000 years ago. And then, for several thousand years, they were everywhere humans were, in Arctic coastal zones, inland forests, and even deep into South America. But they began to vanish. Not because of a single event, but likely through layers of displacement. Later migrations brought other dog lineages, and with them came competition. European colonization centuries later would complete the collapse. Diseases, killing, cultural replacement. The A2B dogs were not just replaced genetically, they were unmoored from the rituals, stories, and names that once gave them meaning. Unlike pottery or arrowheads, dogs are not just artifacts, they are relationships. And when the people who understood those relationships were killed or dispersed, the dogs disappeared too. A few fragments remain, in ancient DNA extracted from dog burials in the American Midwest, in skeletal morphologies that don't quite fit modern breeds. But these are echoes. The A2B lineage is functionally extinct, and with it went a whole way of being dog, a way that didn't involve leashes or breeding registries, but rather a mutual reliance shaped over ice, famine, and deep ancestral time. And so the question becomes, how do you mourn a disappearance that no one at the time could name? These dogs did not vanish with ceremony. No one buried the last one with flowers. Their extinction was not a moment, it was a drift. And it leaves behind not just a genetic absence, but an anthropological silence, the loss of a thread in the long braid of interspecies memory. There is a moment in prehistory when the ice began to pull back, but the cold did not leave. Glaciers retreated, but permafrost remained. The mammoth, once the axis of survival across the north, began its slow collapse into extinction. And with it, a way of life cracked open. Hunters who had depended on mammoth flesh, fat, bone and hide now turned their attention to smaller, faster quarry. Reindeer, elk, Arctic hares. This was not an easy switch. The animals were lighter, more elusive, and required more movement to track across snowy plains and shifting seasons. In this fragile adjustment, one companion remained, and perhaps became even more important. Dogs, adapted not only to humans, but now to ice. Between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, we see evidence across the Arctic and subarctic regions of a new kind of partnership. It was not just proximity or symbolic burial. This was functional. This was transport. This was survival. The dogs that lived alongside these cold-adapted groups were not ornamental. They were runners, pullers, carriers. A small number of ancient mitochondrial lineages begin to emerge here, particularly a 2A, found repeatedly in Arctic dog remains stretching from ancient Siberia to the Western Americas. It's not a single origin story. It's a patchwork of cold paths taken together. Some of the oldest genetic links to modern Arctic breeds may stem from this era, but we should be cautious. These were not sled dogs in the modern sense. They were not bred in kennels or selected for show traits. They were simply those that could run far, tolerate cold, and return. And those were the ones who got to eat. In archaeological contexts, we find dog remains associated with hunting tools, reindeer bone piles, and seasonal encampments near coastlines and rivers. Sometimes they are buried, sometimes butchered, sometimes burned. The treatment varies, but the presence is steady. Their roles likely spanned far beyond pulling sleds. They may have flushed game, carried light packs, tracked wounded prey, or simply warned of incoming threats. In many cases, they likely did all of these, depending on the group and the season. What unites them is their integration. These were not camp followers anymore. They were part of the system. Pathological analysis of some ancient remains shows spinal wear consistent with weight bearing, as well as healed fractures and arthritis, signs of long use rather than quick utility. They were not discarded when they slowed down. Many lived long enough to show signs of old age. That alone tells a story. In the brutal cold, keeping an animal alive past its usefulness requires more than function. It requires a bond, or perhaps an understanding. We may never know exactly what these dogs meant to the people who moved across those frozen landscapes, but we can trace the outlines in bone. The same goes for the archaeological sites. Jokhov Island in the Russian Arctic holds some of the earliest direct evidence for sled dog use, with dated remains around 9,000 years ago showing morphological traits consistent with modern pulling breeds. These dogs were smaller and lighter than wolves, but robust enough to carry out long hauls. The spacing of dwellings and tool caches suggests logistic planning, perhaps even early trail systems. One study estimated that the dogs could have helped humans travel nearly 10 times farther than on foot alone, dramatically expanding winter range. But the most fascinating question may not be what these dogs did, but how they became this. Was it selection? Did humans favour pups that kept up, pulled well, or obeyed basic directional commands? Or did the environment itself filter the population, rewarding endurance and tolerance for cold with survival? Perhaps both. In either case, the result was a divergence not just genetically, but behaviourally. These Arctic-adapted dogs were different from the ones living further south. Their diets, confirmed through stable isotope analysis, included more marine resources, likely from scavenging seals, fish or whale remains left by human hunters. Their coats would have needed to be denser, their paws wider. Some skulls show narrower muzzles and shorter snouts, possibly adaptations to cold air. Again, nothing is definitive, but the pattern is strong. This divergence also reflects something broader. As human groups adapted to different environments, so too did their dogs. There was no single domesticated dog. There were many, shaped by region, need, and climate. And in the Arctic, this meant speed, endurance, and resilience. It also meant interdependence. No human could outrun a caribou herd alone. No dog could butcher a kill or build a shelter. But together, across the wind-blown snow and blue-white silence, they became something more than companions. They became a team. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all is that we still see echoes of them today. In the DNA of modern sled dog breeds, yes, but also in the stories told by Arctic communities. Myths of dogs who knew the way home, spirits who took canine form to lead hunters through storms, rituals that honoured old dogs with names and burial mounds. These are not footnotes, they are memory. But much has been lost. Later introductions of European dogs would alter these lineages. Breeding programs in recent centuries have blurred distinctions, and climate change now threatens many of the environments that once sustained these cold partnerships. Still, the bones remain, and through them, a quiet truth. That on the edge of survival, when mammoths were gone and winter never ended, humans were not alone. They had help. Small, four-legged, often silent help, who ran beside them across the ice, not because they were told to, but because they had chosen to. And in choosing, they changed. So did we. There are dog bones on islands that humans hadn't named yet. Buried deep beneath layers of wind-blown sand and shell midden, the remains of dogs appear in places where the only way in was by boat. Channel Islands off the California coast, Arctic isles shrouded in fog, rocky outposts that suggest a mystery older than maps. The question is not only how the dogs got there, it's why they were brought, and what they were already doing well enough that humans never considered leaving them behind. By the early Holocene, between roughly 10,000 and 3,000 years before the present, the ice had begun to retreat for good. Shorelines reformed, forests moved northward, and with the changing coasts came a different kind of human life. A life that followed water. Maritime foragers, fishers, and island hoppers began to leave a clearer archaeological footprint across the edges of continents. And in a pattern that is now hard to dismiss as coincidence, dogs appear alongside them. These were not the village scavengers of settled Neolithic societies. These were animals that boarded boats. On the Channel Islands, dog remains show up in contexts that imply deep integration with human lifeways. Some of the oldest dated remains belong to the so-called island fox of San Nicolas and Santa Cruz, a species genetically derived from dogs, but dwarfed by island isolation. Whether transported intentionally or accidentally, their arrival suggests dogs had already become embedded in human patterns of movement and provisioning. In sites like Daisy Cave and Arlington Springs, canine remains are often found among food waste and shell tools, meaning the animals likely lived alongside people, not merely as companions but as part of the ecology of survival. In British Columbia, coastal archaeological layers show repeated co-presence of dog remains and fishing tools, along with patterns of intergenerational habitation. The dogs seem to have played a role in hauling, guarding, and even herding marine mammals in certain cases. There is also isotopic evidence that dogs in these regions consumed marine diets, rich in salmon and shellfish. This was not incidental scavenging. These dogs were fed, sometimes ritually buried, and often preserved in oral traditions that assign them protective and spiritual roles at sea. Along the Pacific Northwest and the Bering Sea, the archaeological visibility of dogs becomes more pronounced in seafaring contexts. Their remains are found in kayak hunting societies and coastal base camps where year-round marine resource extraction occurred. The functional presence of dogs in these economies likely included sled hauling over coastal ice, scent trailing, and possibly even serving as early warning systems against predators or rival groups. There is an understated consistency to their presence. Where humans adapted to maritime life, dogs adapted with them. This pattern extends across the Arctic Circle. In Siberia, dogs were already being used as draft animals by the end of this period, and along the coasts of Greenland and Labrador, they were entombed near humans in burials that date to roughly 4,000 years ago, signalling something deeper than utilitarian use. In many of these societies, mythology framed dogs as guides, not just in life, but in death, figures who could navigate rivers of ice and shadow. What makes these discoveries especially compelling is the implication of agency on both sides. For a dog to cross a sea channel, someone had to bring it. But for a dog to thrive there, it had to offer something in return. These weren't house pets. They weren't baggage. They were partners in mobility. Some may have pulled loads. Others may have simply endured hunger and salt air without complaint. But the result was the same. On new shores, in strange climates, they stayed. And they helped. We tend to think of maritime expansion as a human achievement. Boats, sails, courage. But perhaps it also relied on the quiet resilience of a species that could be trusted not to panic when the land disappeared behind them. Dogs likely didn't understand where the boats were going, but they understood the people on board. That was enough. And in return, people came to rely on the dogs as part of the journey. Island sites from Japan to Scandinavia, from the Aleutians to the Mediterranean, are beginning to show a similar pattern. Wherever humans crossed water habitually, dogs were not far behind. And not all of them were the same. Coastal dog lineages show distinct genetic and morphological adaptations, some small and fox-like, others large and wolfish. In some cases, populations became isolated and genetically unique. In others, they remained genetically tethered to the mainland through occasional crossings. What unites these dogs, across cultures and oceans, is that they seem to know the sea, not in a mythic sense, but in a practical one. They knew when to duck into the boat. They knew how to balance against the rocking. They knew when the tide changed, and they knew who they were travelling with. It is not romanticism to say they earned their place. It is logistics. In a fragile world of hunger and driftwood, only useful animals were kept. And yet the usefulness was never just physical. Dogs also occupied a symbolic space in these societies. In some coastal traditions, dogs were the only animals permitted into sacred shelters. In others, their howls were interpreted as warnings from beyond the fog. The boundary between function and meaning, as always in deep history, is impossible to draw cleanly. But what we see again and again is this. When humans moved across water, the dogs moved too. And when they died, they were buried not far from the bones of those they had followed. So how did dogs get to islands humans hadn't named yet? By knowing the right humans to follow, by being just wild enough to survive the journey, and just tame enough to be allowed aboard. By adapting to fish, salt, silence, by becoming more than what they were. It is one of the quietest revolutions in prehistory. No monuments, No traceable line of conquest. Just paw prints, midden bones, and the occasional burial facing east. The story of a dog dispersal across the coastlines is not a single event, but a habit. A repeated decision made thousands of times over thousands of years by people who chose not to leave these animals behind, and by animals who chose to stay. The only thing more mysterious than how they got there is how well it worked. We often ask how early humans conquered the sea, but maybe the better question is who went with them, and why, after so many generations, we still miss them when they're gone. It might seem obvious now, in hindsight, that dogs came from wolves, but nothing about that transformation was obvious when it was happening, and even now nothing about it is simple. Across continents, climates, and cultures, dog-like remains begin appearing in the archaeological record between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago. They appear in burial pits and hunting camps, beside hearths and midden piles, with no single moment of invention, no clear line where one species ends and another begins. The further back we go, the fuzzier the boundary becomes between wild and not so wild. And for a long time, scientists asked what might seem like a straightforward question. Did dogs come from one place or many? For decades, competing theories proposed either a single origin, one domestication event somewhere in Eurasia, or multiple domestications, perhaps arising independently wherever humans and wolves collided in enough proximity for long enough. After all, if humans across Europe, Central Asia and East Asia were all living alongside wolves in roughly similar ways, why wouldn't they each have had their own moment of partnership? And in the fossil record there were hints. Some of the earliest proposed dog-like skulls came from Belgium, others from Siberia, still others from the Near East and China. Was this the same story told in different places, or different stories that happened to converge? The problem, of course, is that skulls don't speak, and bones only tell part of the story. For decades, paleontologists and archaeologists worked with what they had. Crania with shortened snouts, changes in toothwear, a lessened sagittal crest. But these features are ambiguous. A wolf raised around humans might develop some of them without truly becoming a dog. Environmental pressures alone could alter morphology, and so the debate remained unresolved until genetics entered the scene. Over the past 20 years, advances in ancient DNA analysis have shifted the conversation, and as more dog genomes were sequenced, both ancient and modern, a surprising pattern began to emerge. The diversity of ancient dog DNA did not suggest multiple independent domestications. Instead, it pointed to a single ancestral wolf population, now extinct, from which all known domestic dogs descend. This population appears to have diverged from other wolves between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, and while dogs rapidly diversified after that, the genetic foundation seems to come from a single domestication event. That doesn't mean the story was linear. After their origin, early dogs interbred with local wolves in many regions, introducing complexity into their genomes. Dogs in the Americas, for example, show traces of admixture with ancient North American wolves, while others in East Asia or Siberia carry genetic signatures from the regional canids they encountered. These secondary gene flows created the wide variety of early dog lineages, but the root remains the same. Interestingly, this genetic picture is complicated not by too little data, but by its richness. Some ancient dog genomes show such early divergence from each other that scientists once wondered if they might have stemmed from separate domestication events. But the consensus now leans toward a single origin, followed by rapid geographic spread, isolation, adaptation, and local interbreeding. What looked like multiple origins was more likely multiple adaptations of the same origin. Still, this isn't a settled matter. Science rarely is. New discoveries could shift the picture again. As of now, though, the majority of genetic evidence supports the idea that dogs came from one place, one group of wolves, one strange evolutionary corridor in which proximity, pressure, and time allowed something new to emerge. But that doesn't make it a simple story, because even if all dogs descend from a single origin, they did not all live the same lives. Some hunted alongside mammoth-tracking humans, others guarded early foragers' camps, some crossed ice sheets, others sailed to islands. In each case, dogs adapted not just to environments but to roles, becoming trackers, guardians, companions, scavengers, They changed alongside us again and again. One origin, yes, but many lives, many cultures, many meanings. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that dogs came from one place, but that the bond was strong enough to endure everywhere. Once it formed, it didn't need to be reinvented, it just kept spreading. This was not a domestication that had to be done over and over. It was one that, once it happened, never really stopped. And today, when a dog lies beside a fire or watches a child sleep, or pads behind a wandering shepherd, it doesn't matter where that first spark came from. The result is the same, an ancient alliance still holding. The haunting question is not how many times we domesticated dogs. It's why we never let go after the first. For many years, the idea that dogs might have more than one origin was seen as a kind of default setting in archaeology. After all, humans were everywhere. Wolves were everywhere. It made a certain kind of intuitive sense that domestication could have happened multiple times in multiple places. And for a while, that's exactly what the evidence seemed to suggest. Dogs in the Americas looked genetically distinct from dogs in Siberia. Dogs in Africa didn't quite match the profiles found in Europe or the Near East. Ancient dog remains found in Central Asia had features that seemed unusually archaic, and with each new find, the possibility of the multiple domestications was resurrected, like a ghost that refused to settle. But then the genomes got better, and the better they got, the stranger the picture became. What once looked like multiple origins began collapsing into one tangled but shared history. Most ancient dogs, despite their diversity in form and location, seem to carry echoes of a common ancestor, an ancestral dog population that no longer exists in the wild. It didn't matter whether they were buried beside mammoth hunters in Siberia, sailing with maritime foragers in California, or walking alongside reindeer trackers in the European tundra. They all shared, at the deepest level of their DNA, the signature of one bond. That bond, however, didn't mean one place. It's likely that dogs spread rapidly and widely after their initial divergence from wolves. Some populations probably did mix with local wolves along the way, adding layers of regional difference. Others were isolated, evolving along their own paths for thousands of years before vanishing. But the core lineage, that strange now absent ghost wolf, held on in all of them. Like a whisper passed from fire to fire, it echoed through the bones and blood of every ancient dog, no matter how far from home it had wandered. And yet the origin question still lingers, because even with genetic convergence, the archaeological picture remains fractured. Some sites suggest early dogs in the Altai Mountains, others lean toward Western Eurasia, a few even raise eyebrows in the Levant. But no single location has managed to carry the full weight of the story. So perhaps the problem isn't where dogs came from. Perhaps it's the way we keep asking the question. The domestication of dogs might not have been a single lightning strike. It might have been a long, smouldering burn, a gradual unfolding of cooperation and mutual curiosity, spread out across thousands of years and a dozen borderlands. One bond, many fires, one origin maybe, but many beginnings. What makes this story even more haunting is that the true ancestral population, the ghost wolf that carried this bond, is gone. We've never found its bones. We've never sequenced its full genome. All we have are traces, inferred through what remains in dogs, which means, in a strange way, that dogs are not just our companions. They are also the last witnesses to a lineage that disappeared while we weren't looking. And maybe that's what makes the bond unique. Not the fact that we made dogs, or that they made us, but that something else, something now lost, gave us both the chance. It's tempting in stories like this to seek a grand resolution, a moment when the mystery ends, when the data finally fits into a neat timeline, and the world becomes clear. But with dogs, clarity is rarely the final chapter. Instead, it's humility. We know more than we ever have. We've sequenced ancient genomes from icy caves, traced isotopes from bones buried 10,000 years ago, and modelled dispersals across forgotten landscapes, and still we are left with uncertainty. Not because the evidence is lacking, but because the past is vast, and we're just learning how to listen to it. So the question isn't really how many times we domesticated dogs. The question is how long we were willing to keep the bond alive, and what it says about us, that even before the rise of cities, kings and calendars, some small part of our species knew how to hold on to something wild without needing to conquer it. And as we trace that bond through the rest of this story, it might help to remember, not every ancestor leaves behind a fossil. Some just leave a friend. They were never really tamed, not in the way we sometimes imagine. No leash, no whistle, no soft pat on the head from a bored Bronze Age boy. The earliest dogs of the Near East didn't arrive into our world fully trained. They were born from its tensions, somewhere between survival and settlement, between the slow burn of the last ice age and the first rows of barley seeds pressed into Levantine soil. Dogs began to emerge not just as companions, but as constants. This was not a story of sudden change. It was something closer to fusion, a convergence of paths that had been running in parallel for thousands of years, until finally they began to twist together. Around 10,000 years before the present day, in a region stretching from modern-day Israel into the Anatolian plateau, we begin to find something we hadn't quite seen before. Dogs embedded in human settlement, not just camp. These animals were not scavengers lurking at the edge of Paleolithic fires anymore. They were closer, spatially and socially. We find them in some of the earliest sedentary villages, places like Ain Malahar, where circular stone huts ringed by grinding stones and hearths hint at the dawn of a very different lifestyle. These settlements, pre-agricultural or just barely on the cusp, were not farms in the modern sense, but they were rooted, persistent, and smelled of meals cooked in the same place for generations. Dogs lived there too, and not just as coincidence. The archaeological layer cake of these sites includes bones that match morphologically with known early dogs. These were no longer wolves. They were smaller, lighter-boned, and in many cases bore signs of healed injuries, suggesting they had lived long enough to recover, which often in the wild doesn't happen, not without help. From a genetic standpoint, this region offers one of the strongest signals for a large and persistent population of early dogs. Mitochondrial evidence points to what's called haplogroup A, a lineage already well established by this time, and one that would later spread throughout Europe and parts of Africa. But again, what matters isn't the code, it's what it implies. These dogs weren't just hanging on, they were thriving in a context that had changed radically. The great glaciers were retreating, the megafauna were thinning out, and the humans, once seasonal wanderers of steppe and forest, were beginning to tether themselves to place. Dogs did not resist this shift. They adapted to it, and maybe even helped it along. What were they doing? It's hard to say with certainty. But if you look closely at sites like Halanchimi or Sayonu in southeastern Anatolia, communities that predate full-blown agriculture yet hint at organised lifeways, you find more than bones. You find pattern. Dogs appear in domestic space, near human remains, occasionally in burial contexts, though less ceremonially than in later eras. They are, for lack of a better word, present. And when you map that presence across space and time, you start to see something strange. The density and spread of dog remains in the Near East suggest not just passive coexistence, but active partnership. These dogs were most likely performing tasks, guarding food stores, alerting to danger, following human routes to water or wild stands of grain. In a world before fences, before granaries, before locks, this would have been no small thing. There's also a behavioural clue buried in the bones themselves. The ratio of juvenile to adult dog remains skews older than what you'd expect from wild populations, which might suggest that some form of human-assisted breeding, or at least protection of young dogs, was underway. Not as deliberate as kennel selection, of course, but enough to shape the next generation, enough to bend the curve of natural selection just a little more toward tameness, toward proximity. This isn't just a story of the Near East adopting dogs, it's also about what the Near East was becoming, and how dogs fit into that. As people began experimenting with domesticated plants, with sheep and goats, with architecture and storage, they created entirely new types of ecological niches. Dogs filled some of those, but they also shaped them. A dog that barked at an intruder could change the structure of a settlement. A dog that helped herd goats might influence the way those goats were moved. A dog that kept rodents at bay could shift how and where food was stored. These aren't inventions, they're adaptations, quiet ones, but they matter. The archaeological record here, like most places, is frustratingly uneven. Not every early village preserved its dog bones. Not every find has been clearly dated or genetically sequenced. And not every canine fossil is easy to distinguish from its wild relatives. but the pattern is strong enough to suggest that by 10,000 years ago, dogs were fully integrated into Near Eastern lifeways. They weren't tools, they weren't pets, they were something else, a category we're still struggling to name. Not livestock, not wild, just there, living with us, eating with us, and, as later burials suggest, sometimes dying with us too. This raises a haunting question. Did we bring dogs to the farms, or did they bring us to the fields? It sounds poetic, but it's not empty speculation. Think of it this way. If you're a group of humans deciding where to stay, which valley to settle in, which hilltop to build on, and you've got dogs that hunt, guard and guide, would their presence tilt your decision? Would their behaviour become part of your behaviour? Would your future become, in some small but irreversibly meaningful way, entangled with theirs? We don't know the answer. But the archaeological record of the Near East whispers that the bond was already deep. The genetics tell us these dogs would go on to shape the dog populations of half the world, and the settlements, now buried under millennia of dust and sediment, remind us that domestication wasn't just about control. Sometimes it was about coexistence. Sometimes, maybe, the dog wasn't following the human at all. Maybe we were walking the same path, just not always at the same pace. They say that to domesticate an animal is to change its body, but to truly live beside one day after day, season after season, is to change something deeper. How both of you behave, how you think, and how you decide what is safe. In the aftermath of the last ice age, sometime between 9,000 and 6,000 years before the present, humans began to do something that not even the most curious wolf could have predicted. We stopped following the food, and for the first time in our long and restless prehistory, we asked it to stay in one place. So the question that followed, quietly and urgently, was this: how do you convince wild animals not to leave? And how do you protect them when others try to take them? It was in this strange transitional moment, when mobile foragers became sedentary farmers, that dogs began to take on roles they'd never had before. Not as camp scavengers, not even as hunting aids, but as participants in a new kind of ecological experiment. These weren't just companions to Homo sapiens anymore. They were now the custodians of other domesticated animals, sheep, goats, early cattle. In a world where grass had been fenced, food enclosed, and movement restricted, something had to watch the perimeter. Something had to stay alert when humans slept. And as far as the evidence can tell us, that something had 4 legs, pricked ears, and a deep understanding of threat. The earliest indications of livestock guarding behaviour come not from textual records, because writing wouldn't exist for several millennia, but from patterns. The patterns of bones, of sights, of movement. In Anatolia, in the Zagros, in the highlands of Iran, archaeozoologists have identified the remains of dogs that are unusually large and robust. These dogs don't seem to match the morphology of early scavenger-adapted canids. Instead, they bear signs of selection for endurance, strength, and perhaps most importantly, size, and they tend to be buried or deposited in direct association with domestic herd animals. This isn't a casual association. There are indicators of repeated proximity. Chew marks on bones suggest canids fed on livestock carcasses. But more tellingly, the herd animal bones in these early Neolithic villages show fewer signs of predator attacks than would be expected given the still wild landscapes beyond the walls. Something was keeping the predators away. Something had started living not just near humans, but near sheep. The behavioural shift is as profound as the ecological one. Guarding livestock requires a very specific temperament. The animal must be territorial, but not aggressive toward its own herd. It must remain calm in the face of flock movement and unpredictable prey animals. It must be alert but not reactive. And most interestingly of all, it must imprint not on its own kind, but on the animals it protects. This is where the story of dog domestication becomes less about biology and more about behaviour, because by this stage, somewhere between the 9th and 6th millennia before the present, humans were not just tolerating certain behaviours in dogs, they were selecting for them, and not in a modern breeding programme sense, but in the older, slower, more environmentally contingent way. The dogs that didn't chase the sheep survived longer. The ones that barked at leopards but not lambs passed on their genes, and slowly, across generations, the landscape itself began to shape what kind of dog lived on it. In the Levant and parts of the Fertile Crescent, early Neolithic communities began to show stratified site structures, zones for people, zones for storage, and zones for animals. In many of these sites, canid remains appear not in the midden heaps or refuse zones, as we might expect for scavengers, but closer to the animal enclosures. In some cases, small shelters appear to have been constructed not for people, but for dogs. These were working animals, but they were not machines. Their presence suggests not utility alone, but familiarity. And the herding role, while slightly different from guarding, begins to emerge around the same time. Herding requires a different intelligence, not just alertness, but control. To herd is to move something else on command, to anticipate motion, to redirect without harming. There's a deep cognitive requirement in this, one that suggests selective pressure not only on physical traits, but on neurological wiring. It is worth pausing here to remember that no other carnivore has done this. The wolf, majestic as it is, does not herd. The fox does not stand guard over sheep. The hyena does not protect anything except itself. And while humans have tamed and trained many species over time, it is only the dog that has stepped into these uniquely mixed roles. Predator turned protector, hunter turned herder. Not because it was forced, but because over thousands of years it was the kind of animal that could. By the 6th millennium before the present, as agriculture spread through southeastern Europe, we see the signs of this expanded dog functionality reaching new regions. The dogs that arrived with Neolithic farming cultures into the Balkans and later the Carpathians were already different from their upper Paleolithic ancestors. Not just genetically, though that story will come later, but functionally. These were dogs that had spent generations adapting to enclosed worlds. Their roles were no longer passive, they were strategic. Some researchers argue that the very success of early Neolithic pastoralism depended on this coevolution, that without dogs to guard and herd, early domesticated animals would have been easy prey for lingering wolves, jackals or other large predators. That without a mobile and responsive perimeter, fenced-in livestock were a liability, not an asset. In this view, dogs were not just helpful additions to the farm, they were necessary components of its survival, and perhaps more hauntingly, they were willing ones. What we don't see in the archaeological record are signs of coercion. There is no mass culling of dogs in Neolithic layers, no evidence of widespread chaining or constraint. The dogs that guarded and herded seem to have done so freely. Their skeletons show signs of long working lives, of wear and tear, of movement over vast landscapes. But they also show signs of care, healed injuries, maintained teeth, evidence of feeding in old age. These were dogs who worked, and who were, in some cases, clearly worth feeding even after they no longer could. This is the subtle turning point in the human-dog relationship. Not a dramatic shift, not a singular moment of transformation, but a quiet convergence of function and familiarity. A point where utility and affection may have started to blur. When the dog stopped being simply the animal outside the camp and became the one you built the camp with. We cannot say with certainty how widespread these behaviours were, or how uniform. The archaeological record is partial, and the preservation of behavioural evidence is notoriously difficult. But the consistency of findings across the Levant, Anatolia, and parts of southeastern Europe paints a picture that is hard to ignore. By the time humans were planting wheat, building walls and naming fields, dogs had already taken on roles that went far beyond their Pleistocene origins. They were no longer shadows at the fire's edge. They were part of the farm. And so we return to the question. When we stopped following herds, how did dogs help us keep them? The answer, it seems, is with patience, with memory, with a kind of intelligence that anticipated movement and threat, and with a bond that was no longer about shared prey, but about shared protection. It's easy to think of domestication as a human act, as something done to animals. But in this case, the dogs that guarded sheep and herded goats were not the products of force. They were partners in an unfolding experiment, one where both species learned how to live in a smaller, more ordered world, and where survival, once again, depended not just on strength, but on trust. And the question that still lingers is not how we taught dogs to do these things, but how they knew we would need them to. There is a quiet cruelty to extinction that often goes unnoticed, not because it is rare, but because it is constant. Evolution is not a ladder but a field of fallen branches, and some of those branches were once dogs, or close enough that their bones fit the mould, their teeth tell familiar stories, and their ancient DNA lights up familiar sequences, and then disappears into nothing. Around 10,000 years ago, the world held more kinds of dogs than it does now. Not more breeds, but more lineages. Entire evolutionary trajectories, different enough to leave distinct genomic shadows, similar enough to vanish without a monument. These dogs, or proto-dogs, were part of the landscape that early humans moved through, and in some cases moved with. But they did not all lead forward into the lineages we know today. Their traces survive not in kennels or pet cemeteries, but in fragments of genetic code buried in long-abandoned camps, or sealed in permafrost, or in archaeological sites where the dogs that weren't buried with ceremony, but discarded with the refuse. Some of these extinct dog lineages appear in samples from places like the ancient Russian Far East, or early sites in the Americas, or prehistoric China. Their mitochondrial haplotypes do not map cleanly onto the trees of modern dogs. Sometimes they are basal, sitting closer to the root of the tree than anything living. Sometimes they are odd branches that do not connect to any surviving population. What matters is not their destination, but the fact that they once existed, and now do not. Geneticists call them ghost lineages, not because they haunt us, but because they are invisible unless you know how to look. They are lineages inferred from gaps, from patterns that don't add up unless something now absent was once real. These ghost dogs are like faint footpaths in a landscape now overgrown. We can guess their shape from the disturbances they leave in the present. One well-studied case comes from sequencing ancient dog genomes that show patterns of ancestry which cannot be reconciled with any known living dog populations. In plain terms, that means some ancient dogs contributed to the genetic makeup of modern breeds, but others, entire groups, did not. They were their own story, ending before ours continued. In the Siberian steppe, in the Levant, in pre-agricultural Japan, dogs with their own lineage arcs lived and died alongside people, but their family trees terminated. Perhaps their humans died out. Perhaps they were absorbed, replaced, or simply did not thrive as other populations spread. We do not know, and it is humbling not to know, because extinction is not always the result of failure. Sometimes it is the loss of a viable alternative, an unchosen path. These dogs were adapted to worlds that vanished, ice age ecologies, mammoth steppes, pre-agricultural coastal routes. Their bodies may have been perfect for the climates and tasks of their time, but time changed. When we talk about domestication, we tend to speak in terms of success. What traits survived? What genes persisted? But for every successful lineage, there were others that disappeared. Not through error, just through time. The dogs that weren't ours are a reminder that history is not made only by what lasts. It is also shaped by what is lost. Their DNA flickers briefly in our datasets, then fades. Their bones confuse our classifications. Their lives are recoverable only in hints. It is tempting to assign them meaning, to wonder if these were the truly wild dogs, or the loyal ones who followed us into places no one else dared go. But the truth is quieter. They were simply there, doing what dogs have always done, surviving with us, near us, because of us, until they didn't. We often imagine prehistory as a story of ancestors, but it is also a story of cousins who left no descendants, dogs we knew, then forgot. And that forgetting wasn't always an act of neglect. Sometimes it was just the wind, the ice, the movement of camps, the slow changing of tongues. In that sense, the dogs that weren't ours were very much like us. A few of their bones remain. Their genes echo faintly, but mostly they're gone, and still for a while they mattered. It's one thing to bury a dog, it's another to paint one, or to butcher one, or to wear one. Somewhere between the end of the Ice Age and the rise of the first true villages, dogs, once tolerated scavengers and later cold-nosed workers, began leaving marks not just on human economies but on our stories, our rituals, our taboos, and we began leaving marks on them too, sometimes in ochre, sometimes in ink, and sometimes in bone. Around 10,000 years before today, across the Fertile Crescent, northern Africa, and parts of Eastern Asia, something changed in the archaeological record. Dogs stopped being just present. They started being placed. In burials, in middens, in iconography. They began appearing in positions that were not random, curled against human skeletons, aligned near doorways, or carefully posed as if meant to watch or guide. But interpretation is difficult. A dog interred beside a child. Does it mean protection or simple disposal? A mandible cut clean and discarded near a hearth? Food waste or ritual offering? Archaeology doesn't speak in certainty. It speaks in fragments. But even fragments tell stories, and dogs had begun to appear in more of them. In Sayonu, a pre-pottery Neolithic site in southeastern Anatolia, a few scattered dog bones have been found near the skull building, a structure associated with complex mortuary rituals. While no one can say for sure whether these dogs were participants, sacrifices, or just bystanders, their placement raises questions. Were they guardians of the dead? Were they messengers between realms? Or were they simply present, familiar enough to drift into sacred spaces without protest? In ancient Iran, dog remains have been found alongside votive figurines and food offerings. At sites like Tepe Guran and Ali Kosh, some of these bones bear marks of butchery, while others appear unprocessed. Did some dogs serve as food? Almost certainly. But even that suggests cultural complexity. Eating an animal that shares your home is not a neutral act. It implies survival, hierarchy, or symbolic consumption. Other sites suggest something gentler. In eastern Jordan, at the Natufian site of Ain Malaha, dated to around 12,000 years ago, a dog was buried with a woman, its body curled in a mirrored posture. The dog was old, arthritic, likely cared for through its final years. If this was not affection, it was at least a kind of sustained co-responsibility. Not a tool, not livestock, something else. Meanwhile, in Siberia's Zhukov Island, dog bones from around 9,000 years ago show signs of harness wear and controlled breeding. Early sled dogs, adapted for pulling and survival. While this tells us about function, it also hints at identity. These dogs weren't just present, they were selected, controlled. Some were chosen, others perhaps were culled. But bones aren't our only record. In Saudi Arabia's Shuwaimis rock art, dating back over 8,000 years, we see something even more direct. Humans etched with dogs on leashes in hunting scenes. The dogs are stylized, with curled tails and pricked ears, resembling the modern Canaan dog. Whether symbolic or representational, the message is the same. These creatures mattered enough to be drawn, not just used, not just buried, but memorialized, preserved in pigment and time. Even taboo leaves a trace. In ancient Egypt, the dog-headed god Anubis represented embalming and the passage to the afterlife. But in Zoroastrianism, dogs were both sacred and strictly regulated, seen as protectors of souls but forbidden from certain forms of handling. In the Indus Valley, the evidence is thinner, but dog remains in domestic contexts suggest routine presence and possible restrictions. And then, there's the matter of food. In China's early Neolithic villages such as Xishan and Jiahu, dog bones make up a significant percentage of faunal remains, some showing clear cut marks, others burned or processed. Was dog meat a staple, a delicacy, a ritual requirement? It's difficult to say. But their consistent inclusion in refuse pits alongside pigs and deer suggests normalised consumption. Again, cultural logic doesn't always match modern sentiment. There are also patterns in age and health. Many dogs in early Neolithic sites died young. Some show signs of congenital disease or malnutrition. Others had healed fractures, indicating long-term care. These contrasting details suggest different relationships, possibly even class distinctions. Some dogs worked, some suffered, some were sheltered, just like us. And art, always one of the last places to let go of myth, preserves glimpses of these bonds. Tiny figurines, carved in clay or bone, found in Mesopotamia, the Levant and the Balkans, show dog-like shapes curled in sleeping poses or mid-run. Are they toys, talismans, effigies, No one knows. But they're unmistakably canine, not wolves, dogs. Even language holds clues. In the proto-languages of Eurasia, reconstructed root words for dog appear surprisingly early, possibly as far back as Proto-Indo-European, where Akwon gave rise to words like canis and hound. Linguistic trees are theoretical, but the implication is clear. People were talking about dogs before they were talking about wheels, or kings. It's possible, even likely, that many of these roles overlapped. A dog could be guard, food, guide, and companion all within a single lifetime. But by the early Holocene, that overlap had taken on cultural weight. Dogs weren't just tolerated, they were entangled in belief, in burial, in daily life. Still, archaeology warns us not to romanticize too quickly. A carefully buried dog tells us only that someone buried it, not why, not with what feeling. And remains that seem random may once have been loaded with meaning we can no longer decode. The past is not a story, it is a residue. But what a residue it leaves. One filled with scratches on bones, soot in teeth, pigment on stone, and ghost prints in ancient mud. The story of dogs entering culture is not a single event. It's a slow sedimentation. Layer by layer their roles shifted, from watcher to worker, from meat to myth. And perhaps the real shift wasn't in them, but in us, in our willingness to see something more in the creature at our feet. Not just a beast, not just a tool, but a mirror, with a heartbeat, one that shared our shelters, that guarded our dead, that learned our habits, and in turn became woven into our concept of the human. Which leaves us with a quiet question, one still unanswered by all the bones and burials and burnt remnants we've gathered. When exactly did we start telling stories about dogs? And when did they start telling stories about us? Some parts of the human past are loud, carved in stone, buried in tombs, painted in ochre across the backs of cave walls. Others are quiet, more wind than record. Central Asia, across the long sweep from roughly 8,000 to 4,000 years before today, often feels like one of those quieter places. Between the rising grain stores of the Fertile Crescent and the first walls of China's early cities, there is a vast space, and within that space, steppe, mountain and desert. Dogs lived and moved, but they left behind very little to explain how. The archaeological footprint is faint. Scattered bones, a few shallow burials, fragments found in middens. Most are incomplete. Many are not even recognised until decades after excavation, when zooarchaeologists return to reclassify misidentified wolf remains. It's not that dogs weren't there, it's that the record lost their names. Sites like Jaitun in modern-day Turkmenistan provide some of the earliest traces. Dated to around 8,000 years ago, this Neolithic village offers glimpses of domesticated sheep, goats, and cereals. And alongside them, though in much smaller numbers, canid bones. Some are gracile, smaller than wolves, with cranial features suggestive of domesticated status. Others are more ambiguous, blurring the line between wild and tame. The pattern continues across the Kopet Dag foothills and beyond, in the settlements that dotted what is now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But the silence is not just in the bones, it's in the lack of decoration. No figurines, no carvings, no obvious graves. While dogs appear in the material culture of the Near East and Eastern Asia, here they're mostly invisible, part of the background, like the wind. Why? Perhaps their role was so routine, so embedded in daily life, that it required no special record. Or perhaps the cultures that lived here viewed dogs differently, not as sacred, not as symbolic, but purely functional. Guardians, hunters, companions when needed, but not memorialized. A tool more than a totem. Or perhaps something else is at play. Movement. Central Asia is a place of migrations, of shifting cultures, of herders and hunters on the move. And mobile people often leave mobile records. Tents collapse, bones scatter, fires leave ash but little else. The dogs of this region may have been crucial to survival, especially in open landscapes with predators and prey alike. But their traces drifted off with their footprints. There are exceptions. In the Junga Basin, some later sites begin to show stronger signals. A few dogs are found with healed injuries, suggesting care. Others appear in juvenile form, perhaps culled young for reasons unknown. And in the later layers, toward 4,000 years ago, we begin to see more morphological consistency. Shorter snouts, curled tails, crowding into the range of what we recognise as early domestic breeds. But even these signs are whispers compared to the dense data from Europe or the Levant. Genetic studies, where available, suggest that Central Asia was not just a corridor, but a mixing zone, a place where dog lineages from the east and west overlapped, blended, and sometimes disappeared. This region may have hosted local domestication events, or at least hybridization between dogs and wolves. But the genetic signatures are faint, overprinted by later migrations. Dogs came in, moved on, or were overtaken by newer arrivals. Their genes passed through without leaving clear lines of descent. This makes Central Asia a kind of genetic ghost field, important, vast, but hard to hold on to. It forces us to confront a discomforting reality in archaeology. Absence is not the same as insignificance. Just because we can't find the story doesn't mean it didn't matter. In fact, the silence itself may be the clue. In a region defined by seasonal movement, where human settlements rose and fell without monumental stone or deep burial pits, dogs may have taken on roles that were intimate but undocumented. They may have been herders, long before written herding contracts. They may have warned of snow leopards in the dark, or slept outside yurts before we had a word for yurt. They were likely part of kin networks, part of the way knowledge passed, not by script, but by imitation, memory and paw print. There's even evidence in later millennia that Central Asian dogs contributed genetically to breeds that spread across Eurasia. Tibetan mastiffs, Afghan hounds, and various livestock guardians all trace partial ancestry to this blurred middle zone. It's not that the dogs of Central Asia didn't matter, it's that their impact rippled outward rather than standing in place. In a way, their story mirrors the region itself, a place between empires, between languages, between sedentary farming and pastoral nomadism. Not lost, just not still. And maybe that's the point. Not every chapter in our shared history with dogs is marked by graves or carvings. Some are marked only by the space between paw prints, the wide steppes, the silence of the hills, the thousands of years where we moved and they moved with us, without stopping to write it down. So when we ask what dogs were doing in this great middle stretch of prehistory, maybe the better question is, what were we doing that we didn't stop to notice? And what did they learn, walking beside us in a time we forgot how to remember? Some changes are loud, others arrive like mist, replacing the air you thought you knew without a sound. Between 6,000 and 3,000 years before today, something like that happened to dogs, not all at once, and not everywhere, but slowly, steadily, across plains and peninsulas, the lineages began to shift. This period, roughly spanning the late Neolithic into the early Bronze Age, was a time of enormous change for humans. Farming intensified, settlements expanded, metal tools spread, trade routes lengthened, entire populations moved, and with them, their dogs. In the archaeological record, the shift is subtle. At first, it might seem like nothing has changed. A dog skull here, a paw print in clay there. But when ancient DNA is pulled from the bones, the quiet revolution reveals itself. In site after site across Europe and parts of Asia, older dog lineages, those that had been in place since the Ice Age or early Holocene, begin to vanish. They are replaced not by wolves, but by other dogs. Dogs that carried different mitochondrial haplogroups. Dogs that came from somewhere else. We don't see signs of violence, no sudden mass cullings, no skeletal trauma that might suggest a direct canine confrontation. This wasn't a war of dogs. It was something softer, more human. A demographic replacement driven not by tooth and claw, but by migration, marriage, and memory. One of the clearest cases comes from Europe. For thousands of years, the dogs of the continent belonged mostly to what geneticists now call C lineage, mitochondrial haplogroups, descendants of the early canines that had followed hunter-gatherers into Europe at the end of the Ice Age. But around 6,000 years ago, those C lineages began to fade. In their place, a new lineage spread rapidly, the so-called A lineage, associated with dogs from the Near East and Central Asia. The shift mirrors what was happening to people. The spread of agriculture, often linked with movements from the Fertile Crescent into Europe, brought not just seeds and pots, but whole communities. As Neolithic farmers moved in, they didn't always displace local hunter-gatherers violently, but their numbers, technologies, and social systems gradually overwhelmed older ways of life, and as they settled, their dogs settled with them. Sometimes the newcomers' dogs likely interbred with local populations, hybrid litters, mixed traits, but in other cases the genetic record suggests more complete turnover. The older dogs simply disappear from the lineage trees. No direct descendants, no lingering markers, gone. This raises a quiet, almost uncomfortable question. What happened to those earlier dogs? Did they simply die out, unlamented, as their human partners faded into the background? Were they pushed out socially, considered inferior, or not trusted by the newcomers? Were they eaten, or lost in conflict, or slowly bred out of existence? Or did they live out their lives in shrinking margins, replaced by puppies with slightly different ears and slightly more favoured status? We may never know. But it's important to remember that domestication is not a one-time event. It is a process, and sometimes a contested one. Just as human cultures rise, fall, and merge, so too do the animals we live with. Dogs are not a fixed species. They are a relationship, and like all relationships, they change with circumstance. This period also saw increasing specialisation. Some dogs were bred smaller, more agile, others larger, more suited to protection or labour. The Bronze Age was coming, with carts and cities and complexity, and dogs adapted, as they always had, to what we asked of them. But behind the adaptation was a loss. Entire branches of the dog family tree clipped away, silently, over generations. The archaeological record shows new types of burial as well. Dogs buried alone in ways that suggest status, or buried with people in contexts that hint at shared identity. These are not the ancient Ice Age puppies tucked beside mammoth hunters, nor are they modern pets. They're working dogs, yes, but also cultural dogs, markers of affiliation, tools of movement, perhaps even symbols of identity. In some regions the shift is dramatic, in others gradual. But the pattern is surprisingly consistent. The same story plays out in Anatolia, in the Balkans, in parts of the Caucasus, and even as far as the Indian subcontinent. The older dogs, those whose DNA we first saw near the fires of Ice Age Europe, or in the Arctic lifeways, are slowly replaced. Not by wolves, not by something wild, but by other dogs. Dogs that humans brought with them, trusted, fed and buried. There is no known rebellion, no archaeological site filled with the bones of native dogs rejecting their replacements. But we do see echoes of stress, increased pathology in transitional periods, signs of nutritional strain, shifts in diet that reflect changes in human food systems, dogs eating more cereal residues, more domestic meat waste, less bone. Their lives began to mirror ours more tightly than ever before. This period also marks the expansion of long-distance trade. Obsidian, copper, salt, and, quietly, dogs. Puppies were portable. They could travel in baskets, on boats, or walk beside a caravan, and once in a new region, they could change the local population, just as one migrating person can change a village's dialect or gene pool. So while the genetic record tells us of loss, it also tells us of connection. The dogs that replaced others weren't invaders, they were passengers. Their success was a side effect of human movement, of settlement, of change. By the time the Bronze Age was in full swing, most of the older dog lineages were gone from the regions we've sampled. Not extinct globally, but erased locally, replaced by newer strains with different histories. The forests still had wolves, but the villages had dogs with foreign ancestry. And perhaps the most haunting thing of all is that we wouldn't have noticed had we not looked at their DNA. The bones look similar. The roles were mostly the same. The relationship, dog to human, hadn't ended. But the thread of ancestry had quietly changed hands. It's a reminder that history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it replaces itself silently, like a dog curling into a new bed, in a new place, by a new fire, beside someone else. Some never left, while others followed herds across melting tundras, paddled silently in dugouts down ancient rivers, or padded after boots on newly beaten trade routes. A few simply stayed. They curled under the same eaves season after season, watched the same sky from the same hill, and lived out their short, watchful lives without crossing mountains or seas. These were not the wanderers, these were the ones who waited. It's easy to forget that not all of human prehistory was movement. Sedentism crept in long before agriculture solidified it. Some groups found niches so rich they had no need to roam. River mouths, lake edges, marshlands with seasonally predictable bounty. In these places, long before walls or wheat, stability arrived, not in stone, but in rhythm. And wherever humans found a reason to settle, some canines settled too. The archaeological record hints at their presence, but only quietly. There are paw prints embedded in hardened earth floors, compact middens with dog-sized gnaw marks, remains of animals whose lives suggest they moved very little. In certain settlements, particularly in parts of the Levant and the early Anatolian sites, we begin to see dogs that don't resemble the rangy, lean travellers of the Ice Age. These are stockier, sometimes smaller. Their wear patterns suggest repetitive motion in confined spaces. Their bones suggest diets closely tied to human refuse. They are less wild in behaviour, not because they were bred that way, but because their world had shrunk, with us. There's something intimate about these early stationary dogs. They didn't come with us on epic journeys. They didn't herd livestock across valleys or haul sleds across permafrost. Instead, they guarded baskets. They sniffed at fish hung to dry. They barked at the rustle of a stranger's footstep in the reeds. They sat under tables, if we can call stones arranged in a circular table. They slept where we slept, not because we had trained them, but because neither of us had anywhere else to be. In some sites, dogs appear to have had fixed spatial roles, entrances, perimeters, hearth zones. We don't yet know what these placements meant, if anything, but the repeated pattern suggests at least one thing: someone noticed. Someone let them be there. The bones of these dogs often show signs of age, joint wear, dental attrition. Some lived long lives for their time. That too suggests a relationship that was not merely utilitarian. An animal allowed to grow old is an animal that had value beyond the moment. And yet, these are not modern pets. There is no collar, no leash, no grave marked with carved affection. But perhaps their loyalty was measured in stillness, in not running when the world changed, in staying beside us even as the very idea of place was being invented. It's tempting to read into this too much, to assign loyalty where there was simply routine, to imagine emotional bonds where the archaeological record offers only trace evidence and wear patterns. But even caution can't erase the quiet truth. Some of the earliest dogs chose, not to roam, but to remain. In doing so, they may have taught us something new, that not all survival requires movement, that sometimes resilience looks like patience, that partnership doesn't always howl or chase. Sometimes it just sits beside you, watches the fire, waits for the next day. And while the nomadic dogs may have carved the trails of dispersal, it was the still dogs, the ones who stayed, that guarded the routes. We often talk about how dogs followed us everywhere, but perhaps the first true bond was formed not in the chase, but in the pause, in the decision, silent and mutual, to stop running, to stay, together. Somewhere deep in the Pleistocene, a lineage of wolves did not run. It paused, it waited. It began watching us more than hunting us, and we, the strange bipedal apes who had learned to carry fire in baskets and stories in breath, did something equally odd. We did not kill it. This is where the story begins, not of dogs, not of wolves, but of the quiet curve that bent both species into something else entirely, something that walked closer. Over the next tens of thousands of years, something ancient and irreversible took root. It was not domestication in the way we tend to imagine it, with leashes, whistles, and obedience. It was mutual entanglement. We scavenged the same kills. We stared into the same darkness, and we learned, slowly, accidentally, to read each other's silences. This didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen everywhere. But it happened deeply enough that neither species would remain untouched. We did not just shape them. They shaped us. The earliest changes were small. Wolves that lingered closer to human camps may have been less fearful, less reactive. Those who barked rather than fled, who who tolerated firelight instead of vanishing into it, may have had a slight advantage, not from us, but from the world, from cold, from hunger, from the risks of being alone. Selection began acting not just on strength, or teeth, or speed, but on behaviour. And somewhere in this slow feedback loop, wolves that could watch us without fear began surviving better. And so did we. Humans living in small Paleolithic bands, dependent on mobility and fragile alliances, learned that the presence of these animals brought more than scavenging competition. They brought alerts, they brought warmth, they brought companionship, even if that companionship had no word yet. We now believe these emotional cues, these social cross-signals, were not one-way. Both species evolved new capacities, new brain wiring. Dogs became better at reading human gestures than even apes, and humans became more attuned to canid moods than we were to our own kind. That's not metaphor, that's neuroscience. Recent studies suggest that the co-evolutionary feedback between humans and dogs may have contributed to the development of more nuanced social cognition in us. The capacity for shared attention, for joint intention, for responding to another's gaze. These are traits that we often associate with our interactions with other humans. But dogs can do it too. They were doing it long before they had names. This mutual gaze may have had physiological consequences. Oxytocin release in both dogs and humans during sustained eye contact hints at something more ancient than sentiment, a biochemical co-addiction that reinforced the bond. As human societies transitioned from foraging to farming, from nomadic bands to sedentary villages, the roles of these early canids diversified. Some became herders, some guards, others likely remained companions, although that term may still be too modern. But the point remains, their evolutionary path forked alongside ours. We didn't just drag them with us. In many cases, we brought them because they changed what was possible. They made new behaviours, new economies, and new forms of safety possible. We reshaped each other's survival strategies. It is tempting to imagine this as a linear story, but it isn't. The genetic record shows bursts of divergence and collapse. Lineages that flourished in one part of the world vanished in another. Some dogs replaced others. Some human groups adopted dogs anew. And through this, the bond remained resilient. The evolutionary leash was invisible but taut. And though the cultural meanings changed, from sacred figures to taboo eaters to divine messengers, the proximity never quite disappeared. We also learned, across continents and cultures, to incorporate dogs into ritual. They were buried with us, painted beside us, fed with us, eaten with us, and mourned with us. These are not signs of ownership, these are signs of co-presence, and the fact that they show up independently, in archaeological layers separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, tells us something remarkable. The bond did not travel. It emerged again and again from the same shared vulnerabilities. The emotional presence of dogs in human history is not a soft topic. It is a measurable evolutionary pressure. And like all evolutionary pressures, it left marks, not just in bones, but in brains, in choices, in myth. It shaped how we approached threat, how we used space, how we planned. Dogs altered the ways we perceived the world, and the ways we responded to it. Even now, studies show that human stress levels drop in the presence of familiar dogs. Heart rates slow, breathing deepens. This is not sentimentality, this is residue. Some of our most stable emotional associations, loyalty, protection, unconditional presence, may have been scaffolded by our long proximity to these animals. And we, in turn, offered them something rare in the animal kingdom, not just food or shelter, but social identity, a place in the group, a function in the ritual, a space in the memory. For over 20,000 years we co-edited each other's survival, and yet the story remains open. We do not know how many lineages were lost, how many mutual intelligences flickered briefly before vanishing in wars, famines, migrations, or simply the erosion of time. What we do know is this: the version of humanity we became, the one that learned to settle, to bond, to grieve, did so with dogs at our side, or perhaps more precisely at our threshold, between the wild and the known, between the outside and the hearth, and if there is still something unspoken that passes between a human hand and a dog's gaze, it is not just habit, it is not nostalgia, it is memory, a memory older than language, one that still walks quietly beside us. But if coevolution means anything at all, it doesn't just refer to changing skulls or shifting mitochondrial branches, it refers to what couldn't have emerged alone. There is no gene for cooperation, yet somehow it spread. There's no fossil for loyalty, yet it lingered. A line was crossed when wolves stopped running and humans stopped pushing them away. But the more haunting truth is this: we didn't just train animals, we were trained too. Every generation that lived beside canids, in the cold, in hunger, in siege, in celebration, carried that mutual imprint deeper into their behavioural norms. We began selecting, not just for utility, but for empathy, for trust, for response to tone, and so did they. In that sense, some parts of us, the need for a watchful presence, the reflex to share scraps, the ability to bond across species boundaries, may be less a feature of culture and more a residue of prolonged coexistence. Not learned, but inherited. Not taught, but shaped. And once that path had begun, there was no turning back. The ones who feared animals stayed behind. The ones who understood them wandered farther. This isn't a fable, it's the fossil record, behaving more like myth than we expected. What looks like domestication in bones may, in behaviour, have been something quieter. Not control, not conquest, but convergence. We walked through the same ice, faced the same starvation, heard the same winds. One species looked at the other and didn't run. And something inside both changed, and perhaps that's all it took. Not a plan, not a breakthrough, just a moment held between firelight and eyeshine, long enough to echo through 30,000 years. There are no wild dogs at your door tonight, no wolves on the ridge, waiting to scavenge what's left of your kill. No shared silence under a glacial sky, but the feeling persists. Somewhere, deep in the folds of our cognition, is a space that was made not just for others, but for another kind. Not a tool, not a weapon, not a threat. Something that watched, waited, and eventually stayed. This is not about modern dogs, not about names, collars, or clever tricks. It is about the thing that made us stop being afraid of a predator, just long enough for it to see us as something other than prey. It is about the kind of presence that doesn't speak, doesn't demand, doesn't explain itself. It simply lingers. And in its lingering, alters the emotional temperature of the space it occupies. That may be the oldest form of alliance we ever knew. We are not the same species we were before that silence was shared. Something fundamental shifted. Not because we tamed nature, but because we were brave enough to trust it. In moments, in fragments, in hard winters and low food and long stares across flickering firelight. That trust was never guaranteed. It was tested, over and over. Some lines held, some broke, some lineages vanished entirely. But the ones that lasted, those are the ones that remembered how to stay. And so the question isn't whether you could tame a wolf. We never really did. The question is whether, in your quietest, most honest moments, sitting in the dark with no need to speak, would a wolf choose to sit near you? Would your scent, your breath, your stillness be enough to say, "I am not your threat. I am not your prey. I am simply here, and I see you"? That's the firelight test. Not what you can force, but what you can attract by being worthy of proximity. And maybe, just maybe, that is what we have always been trying to become. Something the wild might come back for. Something it might sit beside one more time, no leash, no command. Just eyeshine, and the cold and the quiet recognition that, for one impossible moment in prehistory, we made room for each other. And neither one of us ran. Maybe that's the quiet legacy we've carried, even if we no longer recognize it. Not the bark, not the tail, not the fur, but the arrangement of emotional architecture that once made space for a kind of closeness that had no words. The feeling of another heartbeat in the dark, aligned with your own. Not out of fear, not out of training, but because the silence felt safer when it was shared. Long before agriculture, before herding, before symbols and altars and cities, there was a threshold, and two species hovered on either side of it. One had fire, the other had fangs. Neither understood the full weight of the choice they were making, but they stayed. And once they stayed, they watched. And once they watched, they learned. From each other, about each other, with each other. That's not a myth. That's evolutionary time rendered in behaviour. The fossil record shows you bones and burial sites. The DNA shows you divergence and migration. But the behaviour, the choice to linger, to wait, to not flee, that's something you can only see in hindsight. When you look back and realise how unlikely it all was, how thin the line was between species that survived separately and those that began to blur their edges, this is not the story of dominance, it's the story of proximity. Not every wolf became a partner. Most didn't. Many ran, many were killed, some were eaten. This wasn't a fairy tale, it was an Ice Age negotiation. But for the few who remained, for the ones who approached the campfire not with a growl but a pause, something irreversible happened. That moment is not visible in the archaeological record. It doesn't fossilise. But it might be more real than any tool or artefact we've found, because it continues, in some form, in some trace. The impulse to share our space with something that doesn't speak our language, but understands us anyway. The impulse to be seen across a species boundary and not flinch. It may be one of the oldest instincts we still trust. We don't always honour it. We've bred dogs for everything from war to whimsy. We've lost lineages, manipulated traits, even confused loyalty with obedience. But none of that erases what happened at the beginning, when there were no leashes, when there was only snow, hunger, danger, and still the choice to stay close. You don't need to believe in magic to see the miracle in that. You just need to understand how rare it is, in the history of life, for two predators to become each other's refuge. Not perfectly, not always peacefully, but enough to endure. So if you sit by a fire tonight, and the world outside is quiet, and your thoughts slow to the pace of breath and crackling wood, consider this. The wild once sat beside us, and for some reason, it didn't run. Maybe the test isn't whether we could pass that moment again. Maybe the test is whether we still remember how to be worth staying for. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do, like subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, just stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.